In the midst of whispered gossip and society's harsh judgment, Lady Ruth Louis stood alone in the corner, draped in black, the whispers of her past drowning out her every step. For 3 years, she'd been nothing but a cautionary tale. But then, out of nowhere, the cold Duke of War appears, his icy stare locking onto hers. He strides towards her, ignores the crowd, and extends his hand. "Dance with me," he commands. "What happens next will change everything. Hello, lovely." If you're enjoying this romantic tale from the past, I'd be so grateful for a like or a subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories of love, longing, and history. And if you're up for it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I read every note, and it always brings a smile to my face. Chapter 1. The Corner and the Command. Lady Ruth Louis had perfected the art of invisibility. She stood in her designated corner of the Pemberton ballroom, a shadow draped in black silk, while the rest of society swirled around her in pastels and jewel tones. At 28, she should have been in the prime of her life, married, perhaps with children, managing her own household. Instead, she occupied this peculiar purgatory, present but unseen, invited but unwelcome, alive but not quite living. The black mourning dress had become her uniform. 3 years she'd worn it, as her father had ordered. Not for a death in the family, but for something he considered far worse, the death of her reputation. The severe cut of the gown did nothing to flatter her figure, and the unrelenting color drained what little warmth remained in her pale complexion. Her auburn hair, which had once been her vanity, was pulled back so tightly it seemed an act of penance, every strand scraped away from her face and pinned with brutal efficiency at the nape of her neck. She might have been lovely once. The delicate bone structure was still there, the wide eyes that had once sparkled with hope. But 3 years of shame had carved shadows beneath those eyes, had taught her mouth to forget how to smile, except in the brittle, meaningless way required for basic courtesy. "Poor Lady Ruth Louis," came a voice from nearby, pitched just loud enough to ensure she would hear. Still wearing black after 3 years. One would think the mourning period for her dignity would have ended by now. Ruth didn't turn. She'd learned not to. 3 young debutantes in pastel gowns, a confection of pink, a vision in lavender, a dream in pale yellow clustered near the refreshment table, their fans fluttering like butterfly wings as they whispered. They were perhaps 19 or 20, in the full bloom of their first or second seasons, their faces alight with the certainty that the world would give them everything they desired. Ruth had been like them once, a lifetime ago. "Mama says she's fortunate to even receive invitations," the girl in pink continued, loud enough that several nearby matrons turned to look. "If I were ruined like that, I'd have retired to the country permanently. At least she'd have the decency not to remind everyone of her disgrace." The girl in yellow leaned closer to her companions, her voice dropping to a stage whisper that somehow carried even better than her normal tone. "I heard she did something unspeakable with a stable hand. Viscount Hartley had no choice but to abandon her at the altar. Can you imagine? The wedding breakfast already prepared, the church full of guests, and he simply didn't arrive." Ruth kept her face perfectly expressionless, her breathing steady and controlled. This was her talent now, the ability to stand amid verbal arrows and show no sign they'd landed. Her hands, encased in black gloves, remained folded calmly before her. Not a tremor, not a flinch. This was her routine. Her mother insisted the family maintain appearances, which meant Ruth must attend these functions, must stand in her corner, must endure the whispers and the stares and the carefully constructed cut direct. She was a cautionary tale in black silk, a warning to other young ladies about what happened when reputations fell. 3 years. 3 years of corners and whispers, 3 years of black dresses and severe hairstyles, 3 years of being present at the edges of ballrooms while life happened to everyone else. She no longer expected rescue. Those fantasies had died in the first 6 months, when it became clear that no one would defend her, that the truth mattered less than the story society had decided to believe. She'd learned instead to survive in the margins, to make herself so small and still that sometimes, on blessed evenings, people forgot she was there at all. Those were the good nights. Ruth's gaze drifted across the ballroom with the detached clarity of someone who had spent countless hours observing rather than participating. The marriage market was in full display tonight. Ambitious mamas positioned their daughters in the Duke of Pemberton's line of sight. Debutantes practiced their curtsies and their laughs, everything calculated to attract the wealthiest, most titled gentlemen. Young bucks prowled the edges of the dance floor, evaluating which girls might bring the largest dowries, which families the most advantageous connections. She had been one of those hopeful girls once, 7 years ago at her own debut, 19 years old, and convinced that a brilliant match awaited her, that life would unfold like a fairy tale. She'd had 3 proposals that first season, all from respectable gentlemen with comfortable incomes, but her father had encouraged her to wait, to aim higher. "You're a beauty, Ruth," he'd said. "No need to settle for a mere baronet, when an earl or even a viscount might come calling." So she'd waited, and in her second season, Viscount Edmund Hartley had indeed come calling. Ruth's jaw tightened at the memory, the only crack in her carefully maintained composure. Edmund, handsome, charming Edmund with his easy smile and pretty compliments. They'd been engaged for 4 months before the scandal broke, before the accusations and the evidence and the terrible morning when Edmund's butler had arrived with a brief note. "I cannot marry you. The engagement is ended. Do not attempt to contact me. H." The wedding had been scheduled for the following week. His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, George Alfred. The footman's announcement cut through the ballroom chatter like a blade through silk. Conversation stopped. Dancers froze mid-step. Even the orchestra faltered, the waltz dying into discordant silence. Ruth looked up, curiosity penetrating the numbness that usually insulated her from ballroom drama. The entire room had turned toward the entrance, a collective gasp rippling through the crowd like wind across water. Ruth craned her neck slightly, trying to see past the wall of bodies that blocked her view. "Good heavens," Mrs. Pemberton whispered to her companion, Lady Rothschild, directly beside Ruth's corner. The older woman's fan trembled in her hand. "The cold Duke of War himself. He hasn't attended a ball since Lady Catherine's death 2 years ago. I'd heard he'd become quite the recluse." "Apparently he's emerged from mourning," Lady Rothschild whispered back, her eyes wide. "Though from the look of him, I'd say his heart is still buried with his poor wife." Ruth found herself genuinely curious now. She'd heard of the Duke of Ashford, of course. Everyone had. He was a legend, a war hero who'd distinguished himself in the peninsula, a man who'd inherited his dukedom at 25 when his father died, who'd married a beautiful young woman and then lost her in tragic circumstances. The details of Lady Catherine's death were whispered about in drawing rooms. "Childbirth complications," they said, "both mother and child lost in a single terrible night." That had been 2 years ago, and the Duke had disappeared from society entirely, retreating to his country estate and his grief. Until tonight. The crowd parted, and Ruth finally saw him. Tall, that was her first impression, well over 6 feet, with the kind of bearing that came from years of military command. His shoulders were broad beneath his impeccably tailored evening coat, his posture rigidly perfect, in a way that suggested discipline rather than ease. His hair was dark, almost black in the candlelight, cut shorter than was fashionable. No artful curls or careful styling, it was a soldier's haircut, practical and severe. But it was his face that arrested attention. Handsome? Yes, in a harsh, uncompromising way. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, and his eyes, even from across the ballroom, Ruth could see they were a pale, cold grey, the colour of winter storms. He looked like a man carved from ice, beautiful, untouchable, and utterly remote. The Duke didn't smile as he entered, didn't acknowledge the bows and curtsies that rippled around him. His grey eyes scanned the ballroom with the methodical assessment of a general surveying a battlefield, and Ruth saw several people physically recoil from that gaze. This was a man who had seen death, who had commanded it, who wore his grief and his authority like armour, daring anyone to come close enough to touch the human being beneath. Lady Pemberton, the hostess, rushed forward with her husband, both of them bowing and curtsying so deeply it was almost comical. "Your Grace, what an unexpected pleasure. We're so honoured." The Duke nodded curtly, cutting off her effusive welcome. "Lady Pemberton, Lord Pemberton." His voice was deep, clipped, with the kind of aristocratic accent that could freeze water. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer pleasantries or explain his presence. Ambitious mothers immediately began pushing their daughters forward, angling for introductions. Ruth watched a determined matron practically shove her blonde daughter into the Duke's path. The girl's face flushed with embarrassment and hope. The Duke looked at her, through her, past her, as if she didn't exist. He moved forward, the crowd parting before him with almost comical haste. No one wanted to be in the path of that cold grey stare. Ruth pressed herself deeper into her corner, grateful for once to be invisible. Whatever drama was about to unfold, she wanted no part of. Her breath caught. The Duke was walking toward her side of the ballroom. No, not toward her side. Toward her. Ruth's heart began to pound. There was a door to the terrace just behind her corner. That must be his destination. He needed air, needed to escape the oppressive attention of the ballroom. She should step aside, make room for him to pass. But she found herself frozen, unable to move as he crossed the polished floor with deliberate purpose, his eyes fixed on her. The ballroom fell into complete, breathless silence. Every eye turned to watch the cold Duke of War walk directly toward the corner where the ruined Lady Ruth Louis stood, in her black mourning dress. It wasn't possible. He couldn't be. He stopped directly in front of her. Ruth's mind went blank with shock. Up close, he was even more imposing. Tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, broad-shouldered enough to block out the rest of the ballroom. And those eyes, God, those eyes were the coldest thing she'd ever seen. No warmth, no kindness, just an icy assessment that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses. He extended his hand, not in greeting, but in command. Lady Ruth Louis, his voice cut through the silence like a blade, you will dance with me. Now. The ballroom might as well have exploded. Ruth heard gasps, shocked whispers, the rustle of fans and skirts as every person in the room leaned forward to witness this impossible moment. Your Grace, I. Ruth's voice came out as barely a whisper. She cleared her throat, tried again. There must be some mistake. One dark eyebrow rose a fraction of an inch. There is no mistake, Lady Ruth. I am asking you to dance. Asking was generous. His tone suggested this was anything but a request. Ruth looked around desperately. Every face in the ballroom was turned toward them. The debutantes who'd been whispering about her moments ago looked stunned. Their ambitious mothers looked furious. The gentlemen looked confused and fascinated in equal measure, and the Duke stood before her, hand extended, waiting with the patience of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. That wasn't a request, Lady Ruth. His voice dropped lower, though it still carried in the silent ballroom. It was an order. Something about the word order, the military precision of it, the absolute authority penetrated Ruth's shock. She found herself looking directly into those cold grey eyes, searching for, what, mockery? Cruelty? Some elaborate joke at her expense? But she saw none of those things. Just ice and determination and something else she couldn't quite name. Your Grace, she whispered. I don't dance. I'm not. I'm in mourning. It was the excuse she'd used for 3 years, a shield against the few gentlemen who'd ever been brave or foolish enough to approach her corner. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those winter storm eyes. Mourning for what, precisely? His voice remained cold, but there was an edge to it now. Your dignity? Your reputation? Or merely for the woman you might have been? The words struck her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, though they were, but because they were true. What was she mourning? The Ruth she'd been before the scandal? The life she might have had? Or had she simply wrapped herself in black and grief because it was easier than fighting, easier than trying to reclaim what had been stolen from her? Her hand trembled as she extended it, placing her black-gloved fingers in his larger palm. His hand closed around hers with firm, unshakable certainty. The ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath as the Duke of Ashford led the ruined Lady Ruth Louis onto the dance floor. Ruth's legs felt weak, unstable. She hadn't danced in 3 years. Not since the scandal, not since she'd been relegated to corners and invisibility. Her body remembered the steps. Years of dancing lessons were impossible to forget, but her heart pounded so violently she was certain everyone could hear it. The Duke positioned her with military precision, one hand at her waist, the other holding her hand at the proper height. Even through the layers of fabric, through her gloves and his, she could feel the heat of his palm, the strength in his fingers. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once to the orchestra conductor. The musicians, who had been frozen in shock, scrambled to attention. The opening strains of a waltz filled the ballroom, and the Duke began to lead. He danced the way he did everything else, Ruth suspected, with absolute control and perfect precision. Every step was exact, every turn calculated. He guided her through the waltz as if he were commanding troops, and her body, starved for movement and music after 3 years of stillness, responded without conscious thought. They were the only couple on the floor. Every other person in the ballroom had retreated to the edges, watching this impossible spectacle, the cold Duke of War dancing with society's most notorious scandal. "Why are you doing this?" Ruth whispered, her voice shaking. "Everyone is staring." "Let them stare." His voice remained cold, emotionless. "I've faced enemy artillery, Lady Ruth. I can certainly face their judgment." "But I cannot," she said desperately. "You don't understand what this will cost me." For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition, as if he'd seen something in her that resonated with something in himself. "And you don't understand what it has already cost me to walk into this room." Ruth looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw past the ice to the man beneath, saw the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his eyes, the way he held himself with the rigid control of someone barely keeping themselves together. He was suffering, just as she was suffering. Different circumstances, different losses, but the same fundamental isolation, the same terrible loneliness of being surrounded by people and utterly, completely alone. For the span of 3 heartbeats, they understood each other perfectly. Then the waltz ended. The Duke stepped back, released her waist but kept hold of her hand. He bowed with formal correctness, and Ruth, operating on instinct and years of training, curtsied. Before he released her hand completely, he leaned closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Tomorrow, Hyde Park, the Serpentine at 3 o'clock. I will expect you." Then he let go of her hand, turned on his heel, and walked directly out of the ballroom. He didn't say goodbye to the hostess, didn't acknowledge the stunned crowd. He simply left, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor until he was gone. Ruth stood in the center of the ballroom, alone under the massive chandelier, every candle flame seeming to spotlight her isolation. Every eye in the room was fixed on her. The whispers began immediately, a low susurration that built and built until it felt like a physical force, a tsunami of speculation and shock and scandal. Did that really just happen? The Duke danced with her? What could he possibly want with Lady Ruth Lewis? Do you think he knows about her scandal? Perhaps he's lost his mind, along with his wife. This will be all over London by morning. Ruth's mother materialized at her elbow, gripping her arm hard enough to bruise. "Ruth, we're leaving, now." But Ruth barely heard her. She was still standing in the center of the ballroom, still feeling the ghost of the Duke's hand at her waist, still hearing his voice in her ear. "Tomorrow, the Serpentine at 3 o'clock. I will expect you." Her carefully maintained invisibility had been shattered in the span of a single waltz, and Ruth didn't know whether to feel terrified or alive for the first time in 3 years. Perhaps, she thought as her mother dragged her toward the exit, past the staring faces and the whispered speculation, perhaps it was possible to feel both. Chapter 2. The Aftermath and the Past. The carriage lurched forward, and Ruth braced herself against the velvet seat, though the motion was nothing compared to the turbulence in her chest. Her mother sat across from her, rigid as carved marble, her face pinched with an emotion Ruth couldn't quite name. Fury, certainly, but also anxiety, calculation, and something that might have been desperate hope. Beside their mother, Beatrice, dear, practical Beatrice, watched Ruth with undisguised curiosity. At 24, her younger sister had already been married for 2 years to Baron Ashworth, a respectable man with a comfortable estate in Derbyshire. Beatrice had done everything correctly. A modest debut, a sensible courtship, a proper wedding. She was living proof that the Louis family could produce acceptable daughters. Ruth was the aberration. "What did you do?" Lady Constance's voice cut through the silence like a whip crack. "What did you say to him? How did you possibly attract the Duke's attention?" Ruth's exhaustion ran bone deep. The shock of the evening, the Duke's sudden appearance, the command to dance, the weight of every eye in the ballroom had left her feeling scraped hollow. "I did nothing, Mama. I was standing in my corner as always. He approached me." "That's impossible." Her mother's gloved hands twisted in her lap. "Dukes don't approach ruined women in corners unless they've been given some encouragement, some signal." "I gave no signal." Ruth's voice came out flat, drained of inflection. "I spoke to no one. I did nothing but stand where I've stood at every ball for 3 years. He walked across the ballroom and commanded me to dance. That's all." Beatrice leaned forward, her curiosity overcoming her usual discretion. "But why would the cold Duke single you out, Ruth? Everyone says he's been in mourning for Lady Catherine. He hasn't attended a social function in 2 years. Why break his seclusion for? She trailed off, perhaps realizing how her sentence would end. For you. For a scandal-tainted spinster in a black dress. I don't know why," Ruth said quietly. "This is a disaster." Lady Constance pressed her fingers to her temples. "Your father will be apoplectic. We've worked so hard to keep you invisible, to let the scandal fade into memory, and now you've put yourself at the center of attention again. By tomorrow morning, every drawing room in London will be discussing this. The whispers will start all over again." Ruth looked out the carriage window at the dark London streets sliding past. "The whispers never stopped, Mama. They only quieted to a level you found tolerable." "Don't be impertinent," her mother's voice sharpened. "You have no idea what your father and I have endured these 3 years. The social embarrassment, the questions, the way people look at us with pity or contempt." "I have some idea," Ruth interrupted softly, "given that I'm the one who stands in corners while they stare." The carriage fell silent. Beatrice shifted uncomfortably. "What did he say to you? During the dance?" Ruth closed her eyes, remembering the cold precision of his movements, the way he'd held her as if she were a military objective to be secured. "Very little," he asked why everyone was staring. "I told him I couldn't bear their judgment. He said he'd faced enemy artillery and could certainly face gossip." "How romantic," Beatrice murmured, and Ruth couldn't tell if she was being sincere or sarcastic. There was nothing romantic about it. Ruth opened her eyes. He was. Cold, controlled, like a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Then why dance with you at all?" her mother demanded. "It makes no sense." Ruth thought of those grey eyes, hard as winter ice, and the flicker of recognition she'd seen there, the understanding of isolation. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "he wanted to shock people. Perhaps I was simply convenient." The carriage pulled up before their townhouse in Mayfair. Not the most fashionable address, but respectable enough. Her father's fortune was comfortable rather than extravagant, sufficient to maintain appearances, insufficient to weather scandal with impunity. "Your father will want to speak with you," Lady Constance said as they alighted, "but perhaps it can wait until morning. You look exhausted." It was the closest her mother had come to kindness in 3 years. Ruth's bedroom felt like a sanctuary after the ordeal of the ballroom. She dismissed Sarah quickly, needing solitude more than assistance, and sank onto the bench before her dressing table. The face that stared back from the mirror was a stranger's, or perhaps it was her own face, finally seen clearly after years of deliberate blindness. 28 years old, still young, technically, though she felt ancient. Her skin was pale, too pale, like something kept in darkness too long. The severe hairstyle pulled her features into sharp relief, emphasizing the delicate bone structure that might have been lovely in a different context, a different life. With trembling fingers, Ruth began removing the pins from her hair. One by one, she pulled them free, until the auburn mass tumbled down around her shoulders. The candlelight caught the red-gold highlights, making it glow like burnished copper. When had she last worn her hair down? When had she last looked at herself with anything other than resignation or shame? She ran her fingers through the waves, remembering. Before the scandal, her hair had been her vanity. Edmund had complimented it once, said it reminded him of autumn leaves. She'd blushed and smiled and thought herself fortunate to have attracted such a handsome suitor. Mourning for what precisely? Your dignity? Your reputation? Or merely for the woman you might have been? The Duke's words echoed in her mind, sharp and cutting as a blade. Who might she have been? Without the scandal, without the accusations, without 3 years in corners wearing black. Ruth stared at her reflection and tried to imagine it. She would have been married to Edmund, would have been Viscountess Hartley by now, perhaps with a child or two, managing a household, hosting dinners, living the quiet, respectable life she'd been raised to expect. Would she have been happy? The question surprised her. She'd spent 3 years mourning the loss of that future, but she'd never actually asked whether it would have brought her joy. Edmund had been kind, she supposed, attentive during their courtship, if not particularly passionate. Their conversations had been pleasant, but shallow. The weather, mutual acquaintances, safe topics that required no real intimacy. He'd never asked her opinions on anything of substance, never seemed curious about her thoughts or dreams. But he'd been suitable, appropriate, everything a woman of her station should want. And then, the day before the wedding, Everything had shattered. The memory rose unbidden, vivid as the day it happened. She'd been summoned to the Hartley estate, an unusual request, but not alarming. Perhaps Edmund wanted to discuss some detail of the wedding, or his mother had questions about the ceremony. But it wasn't Edmund who met her in the drawing room. Lady Miranda Hartley stood by the fireplace, beautiful and cold as a winter morning. Edmund's older sister had never liked Ruth. That much had been clear from their first meeting. Miranda was 29 and unmarried, devoted to her brother with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. Lady Ruth. Miranda's voice had been cordial, but her eyes were chips of ice. "Thank you for coming. I'm afraid I have something rather distressing to show you." Ruth had felt the first flutter of unease. "Is Edmund well? Has something happened?" "My brother is distraught, as he should be." Miranda gestured to a letter on the side table. "We discovered this yesterday, hidden in the servants' quarters." Ruth picked up the letter with trembling hands. It was written in a feminine hand, a hand that looked remarkably like her own. The content made her blood run cold. A love letter, explicit, passionate, describing intimate encounters, addressed to Thomas, the Hartley family's head stable master, and signed with her name. "This is not mine," Ruth had whispered. "I didn't write this. I've never—" "There's more." Miranda's voice was relentless. "Two servants have come forward. They claim to have seen you in compromising positions with Thomas. One saw you in the stables late at night. Another witnessed an embrace behind the garden folly." "That's a lie." Ruth's voice rose, desperation clawing at her throat. "I've never been alone with any servant. I would never—" The door opened. Edmund stood in the threshold, his face a mask of pain and fury. "How could you, Ruth?" His voice broke. "I trusted you. I was going to make you my wife, and you, with a servant, with our own stable master. Edmund, please, this is all lies. Someone has fabricated this. 2 witnesses, Ruth, 2 members of our staff, both willing to testify, and that letter is in your hand." "It's not my hand. Someone forged it." But even as she said it, Ruth knew how it sounded. Desperate, guilty. The writing was extraordinarily similar to her own. Whoever had forged it was skilled. Edmund's face hardened. "The wedding is cancelled. I'll send notice to the church and the guests. You should return home and prepare your family for the disgrace." "Edmund, please, you must believe me." "I don't believe you." His words fell like stones. "I can't marry a woman of such low character. The engagement is ended." Ruth had looked past him to where Miranda stood, and for just a moment, she'd seen it. The ghost of a smile on Miranda's perfect face. Satisfaction, cold and complete. Miranda had done this. Somehow, for reasons Ruth couldn't fathom, Miranda had orchestrated her destruction. But she had no proof. No way to fight back against forged letters and paid servants willing to lie. So she'd left the Hartley estate in disgrace, and by the next morning, all of London knew. The wedding breakfast had been cancelled, the guests sent home, and Ruth Lewis became society's newest cautionary tale. A knock at her bedroom door jolted Ruth from the memory. She hastily wiped at her eyes. When had she started crying? Enter. Sarah, her lady's maid, slipped inside. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but your father wishes to see you in his study." "Immediately." Of course he did. Ruth stood, catching sight of her reflection once more. Hair down, eyes red, still wearing the black gown that had become her prison uniform. "Help me make myself presentable, Sarah." "Perhaps," Sarah hesitated. "Perhaps you might leave your hair down, my lady. It softens your face." Ruth almost laughed. Her father wouldn't care about softness. He cared about utility, reputation, and advantage. "Pin it up," she said firmly. "The severe style." Lord William Lewis' study was exactly what one would expect. Dark wood paneling, leather-bound books he'd never read, a massive desk positioned to intimidate. Her father sat behind it like a judge behind a bench, his expression unreadable. "Sit." Ruth sat. He studied her for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "The Duke of Ashford danced with you last night." "Yes, father. The entire town is gossiping. I've already received 3 callers this morning, all fishing for information about what this means." "I'm sure they were. What are his intentions?" Ruth met her father's gaze steadily. "I don't know, father. He commanded me to meet him today at Hyde Park, the Serpentine, at 3 o'clock. Something flickered in her father's expression. "Hope, perhaps, or calculation. "Then you will go, and you will be agreeable." agreeable. If, by some miracle, the Duke has taken an interest in you, it could redeem this family's name. Your scandal has cost us dearly, Ruth. Doors that were open are now closed. Invitations we once received no longer arrive. If the Duke of Ashford, a war hero, a man of impeccable reputation, chooses to associate with you, it would restore some of what we've lost. Ruth felt something cold settle in her chest. I thought you wanted me to remain invisible. Her father's jaw tightened. I wanted you to not bring further shame upon us. But if the cold Duke himself has noticed you, we'd be fools not to seize the opportunity. He paused, his next words carefully chosen. Perhaps he requires a wife who is already broken, someone who won't expect affection or happiness, who will be grateful for whatever scraps of respectability he offers. The words should have hurt. Perhaps they did, somewhere beneath the numbness. I see, Ruth said quietly. You'll go to Hyde Park. You'll be demure, modest, agreeable. If he makes an offer, you'll accept it. Do you understand? Yes, father. Good. Now go. I'm sure you need to prepare. Dismissed like a servant. Ruth stood, curtsied, and left. Sarah was waiting in Ruth's bedroom, already laying out clothing options. All black, of course. Ruth owned nothing else. Perhaps this one, my lady. Sarah held up a black day dress with slightly softer lines than Ruth's usual severe choices. It's still proper mourning, but not quite so harsh. Ruth touched the fabric. It's all I have, isn't it? Black, black, and more black. We could add a bit of trim, perhaps. Some grey ribbon at the collar? No, Ruth made the decision suddenly. I'll wear this one. But Sarah, I want you to do my hair differently. Not the severe pins. Something softer, not elaborate, she added quickly, but not quite so punishing. Sarah's face lit with understanding. Yes, my lady, I'll make you beautiful. Let's settle for presentable. But when Sarah finished, Ruth had to admit she looked different. Her hair was still pinned up, but swept back more gently, with a few soft tendrils framing her face. The effect was subtle but transformative, still appropriate for mourning, but somehow less like penance. Perhaps this is your second chance, my lady, Sarah said softly. Ruth met her maid's eyes in the mirror. Sarah was one of the few servants who'd remained kind after the scandal, who'd never looked at Ruth with judgment or contempt. Or perhaps, Ruth replied, it's simply a different kind of ruin. Hyde Park at 3 o'clock was a parade of society's finest. Ladies in colourful walking dresses strolled with parasols. Gentlemen on horseback tipped their hats. Children played under the watchful eyes of nurses. Everyone who was anyone came to the park at this hour to see and be seen. Ruth felt every eye turn toward her as she walked. Whispers followed in her wake like a dark tide. That's her, the one the Duke danced with. I heard he commanded her. Didn't even ask. What could he possibly want with her? Ruth kept her chin up, her pace steady. She'd weathered worse than whispers. The Serpentine glittered in the afternoon sun, its surface disturbed by ducks and swans. And there, standing at the water's edge, with his hands clasped behind his back, was the Duke of Ashford. He stood utterly still, staring at the water with the focus of a man seeing something other than what was before him. His clothing was impeccable but understated. Dark coat, buff trousers, polished boots. No ostentation, no peacock display of wealth. Everything about him spoke of control, discipline, and barely contained intensity. Ruth recognized that stillness. She'd practiced it herself for 3 years, the art of holding yourself together through sheer force of will. She approached quietly, her heart pounding so hard she felt dizzy. Your Grace, I've come as you commanded. He turned, and those grey eyes swept over her with the same assessing look he'd given her in the ballroom. But this time, in the daylight, she could see more. Fine lines at the corners of his eyes, a hardness to his jaw that spoke of clenched teeth and suppressed emotion. This was a man at war with himself. I don't recall commanding you, he said, his voice as cold as she remembered. I recall expecting you. There's a difference. Ruth felt a flicker of irritation penetrate her anxiety. To most people, Your Grace, your expectations sound remarkably like commands. Was that amusement that flickered across his face? It was gone too quickly to be certain. Walk with me. There it was, again phrased as an invitation, but delivered as an order. Ruth fell into step beside him, maintaining the proper distance for a respectable conversation. People stared. She felt their eyes like brands on her skin, felt the weight of scandal and speculation pressing down. If the Duke noticed, He gave no sign. They walked in silence for several moments, following the curve of the serpentine. Ruth's mind raced, trying to anticipate what he might say, what he might want. "I'm going to ask you a question, Lady Ruth," the Duke said abruptly, "and I expect an honest answer." Ruth's breath caught. "Very well, Your Grace. Did you commit the indiscretion for which you've been punished these 3 years?" The directness of it startled her. No polite circumlocution, no delicate dancing around the scandal, just a blunt demand for truth. Ruth stopped walking, looked at him directly. "No, Your Grace, I did not." He studied her face with those winter-grey eyes, and she had the unsettling sensation of being thoroughly evaluated. "Then why have you accepted the punishment?" "Because proving innocence requires evidence I don't possess, and accusation requires only rumor." Ruth heard the bitterness in her own voice. "In society's mathematics, Your Grace, I was always going to lose that equation." Something shifted in his expression. He stopped walking too, turned to face her fully. "You're more intelligent than you pretend to be. Intelligent women in black dresses learn to hide it, Your Grace. Society prefers us decorative and docile." This time she was certain. That was amusement in his eyes, brief but genuine. "I have a proposition for you, Lady Ruth." Her heart sank. Of course, this was about proposition in the uglier sense. A duke wanting a discreet mistress, a woman already ruined who, "I require a wife." Ruth's thoughts scattered. "I beg your pardon. My father's will stipulates I must marry and produce an heir within 5 years of his death, or the estate passes to my brother." His voice remained flat, emotionless, as if discussing a business transaction. "That deadline approaches. I need to marry." I see. I don't want a society wife," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I don't want girlish giggles or expectations of romance. I don't want a woman who looks at me with hope and dreams of love. I want someone who understands that marriage can be a contract between two people who have already survived their worst moments." Ruth felt something cold and heavy settle in her chest. "You want someone already broken?" "No," his voice sharpened. "I want someone already strong. There's a difference, Lady Ruth." "Is there?" "Yes." He looked at her intently. "Broken things shatter further under pressure. Strong things that have been tested and survived, they endure." Ruth didn't know what to say. This was insane. A duke proposing a practical marriage to a ruined woman he'd met exactly once? "Why me, Your Grace? You could choose any woman in London. Any family would be honored to align themselves with you. Because when I walked into that ballroom last night, every woman looked at me with hope, calculation, or greed." His jaw tightened. "You were the only one who looked at me with understanding." "Understanding of what?" Ruth whispered. "What it's like to be alone in a crowded room." The words hung between them, weighted with shared pain. "I'm not offering you love, Lady Ruth." His voice gentled slightly, though it remained cool. "I'm offering you liberation from that corner, a position, a title, respect. In return, you'll provide me with an heir and ask no questions about my grief." Ruth's mind spun. Marriage, to the cold Duke of War. Escape from her father's house, from corners and black dresses and whispers. But also, what? A different kind of isolation? "And if I refuse? Then you'll return to your corner, and I'll find someone else." He paused. "But you won't refuse?" The certainty in his voice sparked something in Ruth defiance, perhaps, or simply exhaustion, with being told what she would do. "You seem very certain of that, Your Grace." "I am," he met her eyes, "because I saw something in your eyes last night when we danced. You're tired of merely surviving. You want to live again." He was right. God help her, he was right. "You have 3 days to consider," the Duke said. "I'll call on your father then for your answer." He bowed, formal and correct, and walked away. Ruth stood by the serpentine, watching him go, her mind a chaos of thoughts and possibilities. She had been told to wear black and sit in corners forever, but the cold Duke of War had just offered her an escape, even if it meant trading one form of isolation for another. Chapter 3. Ghosts and Schemes. The Louis family dining room had never felt smaller. Ruth sat at the table, her untouched soup growing cold, while her parents and sister stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to concern. "Well?" Her father's voice cut through the oppressive silence. "What did the Duke want?" Ruth set down her spoon with deliberate care. "He proposed marriage, father." The words fell like stones into still water. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. "Marriage?" Her mother's voice rose to a pitch that made the crystal glasses ring. "To you? But why would he?" "The terms, Lord William." Cut her off with the sharp authority of a man who valued practicality over sentiment. "What are the terms?" Ruth kept her voice steady, clinical. "A practical arrangement. He requires a wife to fulfill the conditions of his father's will, an heir within a specific time frame, or the estate passes to his brother. In return, I would receive the protection of his name, his title, his position in society." "But Ruth," Beatrice leaned forward, her pretty face creased with worry, "he's the cold duke. Everyone says he's never recovered from Lady Catherine's death. A man like that, he'll make you miserable." Ruth met her sister's eyes, saw genuine concern there, and felt something crack in her chest. "I'm already miserable, Beatrice. At least as a duchess, I'll be miserable with dignity." The truth of the words hung in the air. Lord William sat back, his fingers drumming on the mahogany table. Ruth recognized that look, the calculating expression of a merchant evaluating profitable merchandise. "You'll accept him, of course. This is beyond what we could have hoped for. A duke, the Duke of Ashford, no less. He's given me 3 days to consider," Ruth said quietly. Her father's hand slammed down on the table, making the silverware jump. "There's nothing to consider. You'll marry him and restore this family's reputation. Do you have any idea what your scandal has cost us? The doors that have closed? The connections we've lost?" "William, please." Lady Constance wrung her hands, her face pale. "What if he discovers something wrong with her? What if the scandal resurfaces? What if someone tells him the details, and he changes his mind?" "The man served in the Peninsular War," Lord William said dismissively. "I doubt he's easily shocked. Besides, Ruth was innocent of the accusations." Lady Constance's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "Her innocence didn't matter 3 years ago, William. Why should it matter now?" The words struck Ruth like a physical blow. Her own mother, finally acknowledging what they'd all known, that truth had never been the issue. Only perception, only reputation. "It matters," Ruth said softly, "because the Duke asked me directly if I was guilty, and I told him no. He believed me." Her father waved this away as irrelevant. "You have 2 more days to prepare yourself. I expect you to accept his proposal with appropriate gratitude and humility. This conversation is concluded." Dismissed. As always, Ruth's bedroom offered no sanctuary that night. She sat at her writing desk, a blank sheet of paper before her, her hand trembling around the pen. "Your Grace," she began, then stopped. Too formal for a man who'd proposed marriage. "Dear George," she tried. Too intimate for a man she barely knew. She crumpled the paper and started again. And again. Each attempt felt wrong, too desperate, too cold, too eager, too reluctant. Finally, she pushed the paper aside and simply sat in the darkness, trying to imagine it. Life as the Duchess of Ashford, managing a grand estate, bearing children for a man who'd made it clear he would never love her. Standing beside the cold Duke at endless social functions, playing the role of Duchess while remaining forever separate, forever alone. Would it be better than her current existence? At least she would escape her father's house, escape the corners and the whispers. She would have purpose running a household, raising an heir. She would have dignity. But would she have anything resembling happiness? A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Sarah entered, her face troubled. "My lady, this just arrived for you." A footman brought it to the servant's entrance. Ruth took the letter with a frown. No direction, no sender's name. Just a crimson wax seal, already broken. Sarah must have checked it for propriety. "The seal was unusual, my lady. I thought I should examine it first to ensure it wasn't inappropriate." Ruth's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, completely unfamiliar. "Lady Ruth, you think the Duke's interest will save you? You're wrong. Return to the shadows where you belong, or I will ensure your new ruin eclipses the old. You were meant to disappear. I will make certain of it. No signature, just the threat, stark and venomous." Ruth's blood ran cold. "Who would?" She looked up at Sarah. "Who delivered this?" "I don't know, my lady," the footman said. A street urchin brought it to the kitchen door, paid by an unknown lady. Someone was threatening her. Now, after 3 years of quiet suffering, someone wanted to ensure she remained powerless, invisible. But who? And why now? Miles across London, in the dim sitting room of Ashford House, George sat surrounded by ghosts. The room had been Catherine's favorite. He'd preserved it exactly as she'd left it, the embroidery frame still holding her last, unfinished project. Her books on the side table, the cushions arranged just as she'd liked them. Even the air seemed suspended, caught in amber, refusing to acknowledge that 2 years had passed. On the wall, Catherine's portrait gazed down at him. She'd been 22 when it was painted, 2 years before her death. Beautiful in the way of porcelain dolls, blonde, delicate, with wide blue eyes that had always seemed slightly unfocused, as if seeing something beyond the present moment. She'd been fragile, everyone had said so, prone to melancholy, to nerves, to days spent in darkened rooms when the world became too much. George had tried to protect her, to shelter her from anything that might disturb her delicate constitution. He'd failed. The brandy in his glass caught the firelight, amber and warm. George stared into it, seeing nothing. "Your Grace." Matthews stood in the doorway, his lined face creased with concern. The valet had been with George since his first commission, had followed him through the war, had stayed when others might have sought easier employment. "You should sleep, Your Grace. You've been in here for hours. I proposed to Lady Ruth Louis today." The words came out flat, emotionless. Matthews was silent for a long moment. "I see. And has she accepted?" "She will." Matthews entered the room properly, his movements careful, respectful of the shrine George had created. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but why Lady Ruth? There are many ladies who would—" "Because she won't expect me to love her," George cut him off, his voice sharp. "She won't look at me with hope and dreams and expect me to be something I'm not capable of being." Matthews said nothing, but his silence was eloquent. George stood, walked to Catherine's desk. His fingers traced the smooth wood, remembering. "I failed, Catherine. I won't fail another wife by making promises I can't keep." "Your Grace." "Leave me, Matthews." The valet bowed and withdrew, and George was alone again with his ghosts. He opened the locked drawer in Catherine's desk. Inside, beneath letters from her mother and pressed flowers from their courtship, lay the note that haunted him. "George, forgive me for what your brother has done. I cannot live with this shame." See, he'd read it 1,000 times, had memorized every loop of her handwriting, every ink blot, every tremor in the letters that showed how her hand had shaken. What your brother has done, Edmund, his charming, reckless younger brother who'd been managing the estate while George attended to business in London, who'd left abruptly the day before Catherine's death, claiming urgent matters on the continent. George had been too destroyed by grief to question it then, had accepted the doctor's explanation of childbirth complications without examining it too closely, because the alternative, that Catherine had chosen to leave him, was unbearable. But he'd never understood the note. What had Edmund done? Why had Catherine felt such shame that death seemed preferable to confession? And now, sitting in her preserved room, thinking about Ruth's situation, a woman falsely accused, destroyed by others' actions, something shifted in George's mind. Pieces he'd been too broken to assemble began to form a pattern. Whatever Edmund had done, it had been terrible enough to drive Catherine to suicide, and George had been too consumed by grief and guilt to demand answers. The truth had been waiting for 2 years. Perhaps it was time to find it. Morning brought another letter. Ruth stared at the crimson seal, her stomach churning with dread. Sarah hovered anxiously as Ruth broke the wax and unfolded the paper. "Did you think I wouldn't notice the Duke at your door? Every happiness you grasp will turn to ash. You should have stayed broken, Ruth. Now I'll have to break you again, and him along with you." The familiar signature was absent, but the malice was unmistakable. This wasn't idle threat. Someone actively wanted to destroy any connection between Ruth and George. "Sarah," Ruth said slowly, "you mentioned the crimson seal was unusual. Have you seen it before?" The maid's brow furrowed. I think so, my lady, but I can't quite place where. It's distinctive, though. Most ladies use traditional colors. Crimson is rather bold." Ruth's mind raced. Who would care enough to threaten her? Who would see the Duke's interest as a problem? The answer came with sudden, cold clarity. The same person who'd destroyed her 3 years ago. "Sarah, I need you to arrange something, discreetly. I need to call on Lady Beatrice Thornton this afternoon." Beatrice Thornton's drawing room was decorated in shades of rose and cream, everything soft and pretty and utterly proper. Beatrice herself looked uncomfortable as Ruth was shown in, her hands twisting in her lap. "Ruth, it's been so long." 3 years. 3 years since her closest friend had withdrawn, protecting her own reputation by cutting ties with scandal. Ruth couldn't entirely blame her, but forgiveness and understanding were different things. "I need your help," Ruth said without preamble. "Someone is sending me threatening letters, and I need to know who still wishes me harm." Beatrice paled. "Threatening letters? Ruth, I know who orchestrated the original scandal, Beatrice, or at least, I suspect, Lady Miranda Hartley, but I need confirmation." A long silence. Then Beatrice sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Yes, it was Miranda. Everyone knew it, Ruth, but no one would say anything because speaking up meant standing against a powerful family." "Why?" Ruth's voice broke despite her best efforts. "I barely knew her. Why would she destroy me?" "Because she was obsessed with the Duke of Ashford even then." Beatrice spoke quickly now, as if confession were a poison she needed to expel. "Your engagement to her brother Edmund was seen as an alliance that might bring her closer to the Duke's circles. When Catherine died and it became clear that Edmund's connection to you wouldn't serve Miranda's purposes anymore, she destroyed you." Ruth felt ice form in her veins. "She's been plotting to become the Duke's second wife. She's been positioning herself for 2 years, Ruth. And now that you've caught his attention," Beatrice met her eyes. "Ruth, if you're considering the Duke's proposal, you should know Miranda Hartley doesn't lose gracefully. She'll destroy you again if she can." At Ashford House, an unexpected carriage arrived. George was in his study when Matthews announced, "Your Grace, your brother Edmund has returned from the continent." Edmund swept in before George could respond, all easy charm and careless grace. At 28, he was handsome in a way George had never been, golden-haired, blue-eyed, with the kind of smile that made people forget to ask difficult questions. "Brother," Edmund's voice was warm, but George heard the strain beneath it. "I heard you were back in society, proposing to ladies, dancing at balls. Quite the transformation." George didn't stand. "Edmund, I didn't expect you." "Can't a brother visit?" Edmund poured himself brandy without invitation, a presumption that set George's teeth on edge. "I've missed England, and I heard some interesting gossip about your upcoming marriage, Lady Ruth Louis, the woman in black. Quite the charitable choice. My choice is none of your concern." Edmund settled into a chair, crossing his legs with studied casualness. "Of course not, though I wonder what your poor Catherine would think." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Don't speak her name. Sensitive subject, even after 2 years?" Edmund's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You really should move on, brother. In fact, I'm glad you're finally taking my advice." "When did you give me advice?" "Before I left for the continent. I told you Catherine's death wasn't your fault. You were so consumed with guilt." George studied his brother with new eyes, seeing what he'd been too broken to notice before. The nervous energy, the too bright smile, the way Edmund wouldn't quite meet his gaze. "You left very suddenly, the day before Catherine died." Edmund's hand jerked, brandy sloshing in his glass. "Did I? I don't recall. It was 2 years ago, George. I received a letter from Catherine. Before she died, she mentioned you." The color drained from Edmund's face. "What did it say?" George let the silence stretch, watching his brother's composure crack. "That's between me and my late wife's memory." Edmund recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "Well, I'm sure it was nothing important. Catherine was fragile at the end. Her mind wasn't always clear." After Edmund left, George sat alone in the growing darkness. His brother was hiding something. Ruth was being threatened. 2 mysteries that might be connected by threads he was only beginning to see. For 2 years, he'd remained frozen in grief, locked in Catherine's preserved room, unable to move forward or back. But some battles couldn't be avoided. Only one. George made a decision. He wouldn't wait 3 days for Ruth's answer. He would go to her tomorrow and offer her not just a practical marriage, but an alliance. Together, they would uncover the truth about both their pasts. The cold Duke of War had spent 2 years in strategic retreat, but retreat was over. It was time to fight. Chapter 4. The Alliance. Ruth was reviewing household accounts in the morning room, a task her mother insisted she perform to maintain useful skills, when the butler appeared in the doorway, his face pale with anxiety. "My lady, Lady Constance, His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, has arrived." Her mother's teacup clattered against its saucer. "The Duke? Here? But it's only been 1 day." Lady Constance pressed a hand to her chest, her breathing rapid. "Ruth, Your hair, your dress, you're not prepared for callers." Ruth stood slowly, her heart pounding. George had said 3 days. Why was he here now? The Duke entered without waiting for invitation, filling the doorway with his commanding presence. He was dressed impeccably in dark mourning clothes, his expression stern and unreadable. Lady Constance shot to her feet, curtsying so deeply she nearly toppled. "Your Grace, what an unexpected. That is to say, we're honored. Ruth, stand properly." George's cold grey eyes swept the room, then fixed on Lady Constance. "Lady Louis, I require a private conversation with your daughter." It wasn't a request. The military authority in his voice made it clear that compliance was expected, not negotiated. "Your Grace, propriety demands that I remain present as chaperone. I am announcing our engagement today." George's voice could have frozen summer itself. "I believe that grants me certain privileges regarding private conversation with my future wife. Unless you wish to contest my judgment." Lady Constance's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Then, with a final desperate glance at Ruth, she fled. The door clicked shut, and Ruth found herself alone with the cold Duke of War. "Your Grace," she said, pleased that her voice remained steady, "you said I had 3 days. Circumstances have changed. I'm moving up the timeline." Ruth felt a spark of irritation penetrate her anxiety. How presumptuous. "What if I've decided to refuse you?" George studied her face with those unnervingly perceptive eyes. "You haven't, but you're afraid. Something has happened since yesterday." Ruth's breath caught. "What makes you say that?" "Because I've commanded soldiers, Lady Ruth. I know the difference between simple fear and active threat." He took a step closer. "You're being threatened." The accuracy of his observation shook her. For a moment, she considered denying it, maintaining the careful pretense she'd perfected over 3 years. But something in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a kind of fierce certainty, made her decide. Trust was a risk, but so was remaining powerless. Ruth crossed to her writing desk, withdrew the 2 letters from the hidden drawer, and handed them to George without a word. He read them slowly, his expression growing progressively colder. When he looked up, his eyes were like winter storms. "Who do you suspect?" "Lady Miranda Hartley. She orchestrated my original scandal 3 years ago. My former friend confirmed it yesterday." "Miranda Hartley." Something flickered in George's voice recognition, and something darker. "You know her?" "She's made herself conspicuous in certain circles." His jaw tightened. "She was a friend of my late wife's." The pieces shifted, forming a pattern Ruth was only beginning to see. "She's been positioning herself to become your second wife." "So it would seem." George handed back the letters. "Lady Ruth, I'm going to revise my proposal. I haven't accepted the first one yet, Your Grace." The ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "Nevertheless, I originally offered you a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience, but I believe we're both caught in someone else's schemes." He began to pace, military precision in every step. "My brother Edmund returned from the continent yesterday. He's been gone for 2 years, left abruptly the day before Catherine died. His timing, his nervous behavior, certain things he said. I have questions about my wife's death that were never answered. And now you're being threatened by a woman who was Catherine's friend, who destroyed your reputation 3 years ago, who apparently wants to ensure you remain powerless." Ruth's mind raced, following the implications. "You think the scandals are connected?" "I think we're both victims of people who manipulate from the shadows, and I'm tired of being manipulated." He stopped pacing, faced her directly. "I propose an alliance. We marry, yes, but we also investigate together. You help me discover the truth about my wife's death, and I help you expose whoever destroyed your reputation. You're proposing we become partners in uncovering secrets that powerful people want buried." "I am." Ruth considered this new offer. A practical marriage was one thing, a business arrangement, emotionally safe if spiritually deadening. But this was partnership, risk, purpose. That's far more dangerous than a simple marriage of convenience. "It is." George's voice softened fractionally. "Which is why I'll understand if you refuse. But I think you're stronger than you've been allowed to be, Lady Ruth. And I think you're tired of being a victim." Ruth met his eyes and saw her own exhaustion reflected there. "I am tired of it, Your Grace. Exhausted, in fact." "Then fight back. With me." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Ruth thought of 3 years in corners. 3 years of black dresses and whispered accusations. 3 years of powerlessness. I accept your proposal, Your Grace. Both the marriage and the alliance. George's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere, a settling, as if pieces had clicked into place. You're certain? This path will not be easy. Ruth felt a smile tug at her lips, the first genuine one in years. Neither has sitting in corners wearing black, at least this way. I'll be doing something. Something softened in George's severe features. Then we should make it official. Give me your hand. Ruth extended her hand, and George produced a small velvet box from his coat. Inside lay a ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, the blue as deep as midnight. Not Catherine's ring. Ruth recognized the significance immediately. This was new, chosen for her. George slid it onto her finger with practiced precision. I'll speak to your father today. We'll marry in 2 weeks. 2 weeks? Ruth stared at the ring, watching it catch the morning light. That's extraordinarily fast. Speed is a tactical advantage. Our enemies won't have time to properly organize against us. Our enemies. Ruth tested the words, finding them strange and somehow exhilarating. I've never had allies before, Your Grace. Only opponents. You have one now. They sat Ruth at her writing desk, George in the chair opposite. Though he barely stayed seated, his restless energy forcing him to his feet repeatedly to pace. Tell me everything about the original scandal, George commanded. Every detail. Ruth recounted it all. The forged love letter in handwriting that mimicked hers too well, the servants who claimed to witness impropriety, Miranda's cold satisfaction as Ruth's world collapsed. George listened with absolute focus, asking sharp questions about timing, about who had access to her correspondence, about the servants who'd testified. Where are those servants now? I don't know. After the scandal, I tried not to think about any of it. We'll find them. Servants talk. Someone knows the truth. George's eyes were cold, calculating. And your wife's death? What are you looking for? George was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. The doctor said childbirth complications, but there was no child prepared for, no signs of labor, and Catherine left a note mentioning my brother. Forgive me for what your brother has done. I need to understand what Edmund did. Ruth heard the pain beneath the clinical words. Your Grace. George, if this is too painful, pain is irrelevant. His voice was sharp. Truth matters. I've spent 2 years in mourning for a tragedy I didn't understand. I owe Catherine the truth. Then we start with the doctor who attended her. And your brother. George nodded. Edmund is staying at his club. I'll confront him. You will not be left safely at home like a porcelain doll, Ruth interrupted firmly. We're partners, remember? Where you go, I go. George looked at her with what might have been approval. You have more steel in you than anyone suspects. 3 years in corners will do that to a woman. Lord William Louis practically vibrated with barely contained glee as George made the formal request for Ruth's hand. Your Grace, this is an unexpected honor. An alliance with the Duke of Ashford. I'm marrying your daughter in 2 weeks. George cut him off, his voice cold as winter. I expect you to provide her with a proper trousseau and treat her with the respect due to a future duchess. The mourning blacks end today. Lord William stammered, Of course, Your Grace, though the blacks were meant to be a sign of her repentance. Her repentance for crimes she didn't commit? George's voice could have cut glass. No, those days are finished. The power shift was palpable. Ruth felt it like a physical force, her father's authority crumbling, George's protection descending like armor. She was no longer Lord William's disgraced daughter. She was the Duke of Ashford's future wife. Madame Dubois' exclusive modiste shop had never seen anything quite like the Duke of Ashford's presence. The proprietress fluttered nervously as George settled into a chair with the air of a general establishing a command post. My fiancée requires an entirely new wardrobe. No black, no grey, collars. Ruth stood frozen amid bolts of fabric, overwhelmed. Your Grace, I've worn nothing but black for so long. George's grey eyes met hers. Then it's time for a resurrection, Lady Ruth. Madame Dubois showed pastel silks. Ruth shook her head. Too insipid, too virginal. Whites made her look washed out. Yellows felt falsely cheerful. Then her hand fell on a bolt of deep sapphire blue silk, rich and vibrant. Ah, beautiful, Madame Dubois exclaimed. It matches your ring, my lady. George stood, examining the fabric with military precision. Perfect, we'll take that. And emerald green. And burgundy. Nothing pale or apologetic. Ruth looked up at him, understanding dawning. You're choosing colors like battle standards. That's exactly what they are. His voice was low, meant only for her. We're declaring war on those who hurt you. Hyde Park at the fashionable hour was society's stage, and George insisted they make an entrance. Ruth wore her new dark blue walking dress, the first color she'd worn in 3 years, and felt simultaneously exposed and exhilarated. Every head turned. Whispers followed them like waves. The Duke and Lady Ruth. Is that truly her? She's wearing color. My God, they're engaged. It's already announced in the papers. And there, near the Serpentine, stood Lady Miranda Hartley, surrounded by friends. She saw them, and the color drained from her face before fury twisted her beautiful features. Miranda approached with false sweetness. Your Grace, what a delightful surprise. And Lady Ruth, my, you look quite different. George's voice could have frozen fire. Lady Miranda, you're acquainted with my fiancé. Your fiancé? Miranda's smile cracked. Ruth felt new confidence surge through her. Yes, Lady Miranda, we're to be married in 2 weeks. How? Unexpected. I wasn't aware you two even knew each other. There's a great deal you aren't aware of, Lady Miranda, George said coldly. I'm sure that's frustrating for someone who prides themselves on knowing everyone's business. Miranda's mask slipped, venom showing through. I simply wish to ensure your Grace is making an informed decision. Lady Ruth's history is rather complicated, as is everyone's when examined closely. I suggest you worry less about my choices and more about your own affairs, Lady Miranda. Miranda leaned closer, desperate. Your Grace, I feel obligated to warn you. You feel obligated to do nothing except mind your own concerns. George signaled the driver. Good day, Lady Miranda. As they drove away, Ruth saw Miranda's expression of pure, undisguised hatred. She'll move against us now, George said as they returned to Ashford House. We've provoked her. Was that wise? It was strategic. Angry enemies make mistakes. She'll act rashly, and when she does, we'll catch her. Ruth studied his profile. You really do think like a general, don't you? It's how I survived the war, Lady Ruth. And it's how we'll survive this. Evening fell, and George walked Ruth to her carriage. Before she entered, he took her hand, not the formal gesture of a duke, but something more personal. These 2 weeks before the wedding won't be easy. The gossip will be vicious. Old scandals will be resurrected. Can you endure it? Ruth looked up at him, this cold, damaged man who'd offered her not rescue but partnership. I've endured 3 years of corners and whispers, Your Grace. 2 weeks of active battle sounds almost refreshing, something that might have been a smile ghosted across his features. You continue to surprise me. Good. A partnership requires equal participants. I won't be a silent, obedient duchess. I don't want a silent, obedient duchess. George's voice was firm. I want an ally who can think and fight. As Ruth's carriage pulled away, she looked back to see George standing in the lamplight, no longer just the cold Duke of War, but something more dangerous, a man with a purpose, and she was no longer just the woman in black. She was his partner in battle, and she intended to win. Chapter 5. Secrets and Revelations. Ruth stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, barely recognizing the woman who stared back. Her room had been transformed over the past week. Gone were the endless rows of black dresses, replaced by gowns in jewel tones that caught the light emerald, sapphire, ruby, amethyst. It was as if color itself had invaded her carefully maintained prison of mourning. Sarah fastened the last button on the deep emerald gown Ruth wore tonight. The color made her auburn hair glow like burnished copper, brought warmth to her pale skin, made her gray-green eyes luminous. You look beautiful, my lady, Sarah whispered. Ruth touched the silk fabric, still half expecting it to vanish. I look like someone else. You look like yourself, finally. But Ruth's reflection also showed the anxiety tightening her features. Tonight was her first dinner at Ashford House as George's acknowledged fiancé. She would meet his intimate circle, his family, his closest friends, people who had loved Catherine, who would inevitably compare the cold Duke's first wife to his scandalous second choice. And Edmund Alfred would be there, George's brother, who didn't yet know about the engagement, whose nervous behavior and suspicious timing had awakened George's questions about Catherine's death. Ruth smoothed her skirts with trembling hands. What if they hate me, Sarah? Then they're fools, my lady, and you've survived worse than fools. Ashford House rose before her like a fortress, all grey stone and imposing columns, windows glowing with warm light that somehow seemed cold. The ducal mansion made her family's townhouse look like a cottage. George met her in the entrance hall, and for a moment something shifted in his severe features as he took in her appearance. Not quite a smile, but a softening. "Lady Ruth, you look well." "Thank you, Your Grace." She noticed he wore evening clothes with the same military precision as always, but there was tension in his shoulders. He was anxious too. The realization steadied her. They were both walking into battle tonight. George offered his arm. "I should warn you, my brother doesn't yet know about our engagement. I'm announcing it tonight." "And you expect him to react poorly?" "I expect him to reveal something." George's voice was cold. Edmund's always been careless when surprised. The drawing room held a small gathering. Lord and Lady Thornton, an elegant older couple who greeted Ruth with polite reserve. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a gruff military man with kind eyes who bowed to her with genuine warmth, and Edmund Alfred, who looked up from his drink with the easy smile of a man who suspected nothing. Edmund was handsome in a way George wasn't, golden-haired, where George was dark, charming, where George was austere, with blue eyes that sparkled with seemingly guileless friendliness. But Ruth had learned to see beneath surfaces. She recognized the slight tremor in Edmund's hand, the brightness of his eyes that suggested too much alcohol, the tightness around his mouth that spoke of barely controlled nerves. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "I have an announcement. Lady Ruth Louis has done me the honor of accepting my proposal of marriage. We will wed in 1 week." The effect was instantaneous. Edmund's glass slipped from his fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Brandy spread like blood across the white stone. "Your fiancé?" Edmund's voice cracked. "George, surely this is a jest." "I don't jest about such matters." George's tone could have cut glass. "Lady Ruth and I are to be married in 1 week." Edmund stared at Ruth as if seeing her for the first time, and she saw something flicker in his eyes. Recognition, no fear. Raw, unmistakable fear. "But you barely know the woman, and her reputation is of no concern to anyone but me." George's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "You will treat my future wife with respect, Edmund, or you will leave immediately." The room held its breath. Edmund recovered his composure with visible effort, bending to pick up the shattered glass. "Of course. Forgive me, brother." The announcement was unexpected. "Lady Ruth, I apologize for my reaction. I wish you both every happiness." But his smile didn't reach his eyes, and Ruth noticed how he avoided looking directly at her for the rest of the evening. Dinner was an exercise in careful navigation. Colonel Whitfield proved unexpectedly kind, treating Ruth with the same gruff courtesy he'd likely shown female camp followers during the war, practical respect, without judgment. "His Grace speaks highly of your intelligence, Lady Ruth," Whitfield said over the fish course. "Says you've a tactical mind." Ruth glanced at George in surprise. He'd been discussing her with his war comrades? "I simply understand the value of planning ahead, Colonel. Rare quality in society, ladies. Most just want to plan parties and balls." Whitfield's tone suggested this was meant as a compliment. Lady Thornton was cooler, her conversation polite but probing. "You've been in mourning for some time, Lady Ruth. A family death?" "No, Lady Thornton. Simply mourning other losses." Lord Thornton harumphed into his wine. "Sensible girl. Knows when to show proper contrition." Ruth bit back a sharp response. George's hand found hers briefly under the table. A warning or reassurance, she wasn't sure which. But it was Edmund who captured her attention. He sat across from her, drinking steadily, his eyes darting between her and George with increasing agitation. He barely touched his food. By the time the ladies withdrew, he was clearly drunk. In the music room, Lady Thornton wasted no time once they were alone. "I'll be frank, Lady Ruth. His Grace has been different since Lady Catherine's death. We all despaired he'd ever recover." She studied Ruth with sharp eyes. "Are you prepared for what marrying him entails?" Ruth met her gazes steadily. "What does it entail, Lady Thornton?" "A man who loved his first wife so completely that he became ice when she died. Can you live with being second to a ghost?" The question should have hurt. Perhaps it would have, if Ruth hadn't already faced this truth herself. "I can live with honesty, Lady Thornton. The Duke has made me no promises of love, but he's offered me respect and partnership. That's more than most marriages provide." Lady Thornton's expression shifted, not warmth, exactly, but something like grudging approval. You have steel in you. Good. You'll need it. In George's study, the civility shattered. Ruth heard the raised voices as she passed in the corridor, Edmund's slurred accusations, George's cold fury. She paused, uncertain whether to interrupt. What are you playing at, George? Edmund's voice carried through the door. Marrying that woman. She's ruined. Everyone knows what she did. Interesting that you care so much about my choice of wife, brother. I'm trying to protect you from making a terrible mistake. Colonel Whitfield's voice, calmer. Perhaps I should leave you to family matters. No. George's command was absolute. Stay, Marcus. I want a witness. Silence. Then Ruth heard Edmund's sharp intake of breath. She pushed the door open. 3 men turned to stare. Edmund, white-faced and swaying, Colonel Whitfield, alert and wary, and George, holding what looked like a letter, his expression carved from winter itself. Edmund, George said with terrible calm, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want the truth. What happened between you and Catherine before she died? Nothing. I don't know what you mean. George held up the letter. Forgive me for what your brother has done. Catherine's words. What did you do, Edmund? Edmund's face crumpled. She was fragile, George. Unstable. You know that. What did you do? Colonel Whitfield stepped forward, shock clear on his weathered features. Wait, suicide? I thought Lady Catherine died in childbirth. So did everyone, George said without looking away from Edmund. The doctor lied to protect the family name. Now I want to know why. Edmund broke like a dam giving way. It was an accident, a misunderstanding. I cared for Catherine, perhaps too much, but I never meant. Never meant what? She misinterpreted my affections. She became hysterical. I tried to calm her, but she ran from me. The next day, she was dead. George's control was terrifying in its completeness. You're lying. Part of this story is a lie. I swear, George, I never wanted her to die. What exactly did you do to her, Edmund? Colonel Whitfield's voice was hard as granite. Before Edmund could answer, a servant burst in. Your Grace, Lady Ruth has received a disturbing letter. She asked me to bring it to you immediately. George tore it open, his face darkening as he read. Ruth glimpsed crimson wax Miranda's seal. What is it? She asked, stepping fully into the room. George's jaw worked. Someone is threatening to expose Catherine's suicide and Edmund's involvement unless I call off our wedding. Ruth's blood ran cold. Miranda, it has to be. Edmund looked up sharply. Miranda Hartley, what does she have to do with any of this? The pieces shifted, forming a pattern. She was friends with Lady Catherine, wasn't she? Ruth asked. They were acquainted. Miranda visited frequently while I was in London. Edmund suddenly stood, swaying. She was here, the day before Catherine died. I remember because Catherine and I had our conversation, and afterward, I saw Miranda leaving Catherine's chambers. George went very still. Miranda was with Catherine before she died? Ruth understood immediately. Miranda collects secrets. It's how she destroyed me. She must have known about whatever happened between Edmund and Catherine. Colonel Whitfield cleared his throat. Ashford, if this woman has evidence of your wife's suicide and your brother's involvement, she could destroy your family's name. Perhaps you should consider. I should consider nothing. George's voice was absolute. I won't be blackmailed, and I won't abandon Lady Ruth a week before our wedding. Ruth stepped closer. George, if this scandal breaks, it will ruin you, your position, your reputation. I've survived battlefields, Ruth. I can survive gossip. But should you have to, perhaps we should postpone. George took her hands, and the touch sent warmth through her. No, we move forward, but we do it strategically. Edmund made a sound of protest. George, you can't. The family has been built on lies for 2 years. It ends now. What are you proposing? Whitfield asked. We find the doctor who falsified Catherine's death record. We get him to confess. We announce the truth publicly before the wedding. Ruth felt the audacity of it. That will cause a massive scandal. Yes, but it will be the truth, and it removes Miranda's leverage. Edmund collapsed into a chair. The doctor, Dr. Carlyle. He left London after Catherine's death. I paid him to. He's in Brighton now. You paid him to disappear. George's contempt was withering. Marcus, I need you to ride to Brighton tonight. Find Dr. Carlyle. Bring him back to London. Pay him if you must. Threaten him if necessary. But get him here before the wedding. Whitfield stood at attention. Consider it done, Your Grace." After the others left, Ruth and George stood alone in the study. "George, if we do this, if we expose Catherine's suicide and your brother's involvement, society will be vicious. Are you prepared for that? I've been hiding from the truth for 2 years. I'm tired of hiding. And Edmund? What will you do with him?" Pain crossed George's features. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to destroy him. Part of me. He's my brother." Ruth touched his arm gently. "What did he do to Catherine?" "He didn't finish his confession." George's voice was raw. "I think I know. I've known, somewhere deep, but I didn't want to face it." He turned to face her fully. "Catherine's note said, 'Forgive me for what your brother has done,' not 'Forgive me for what I've done.' She was asking my forgiveness for her inability to survive what he did to her. You think he forced himself on her?" George's anguish was terrible to witness. "I was in London for 3 weeks. Edmund was here, managing the estate. Catherine was alone and vulnerable. When I returned, she was different, afraid, withdrawn. I thought it was her usual melancholy. I didn't protect her." Ruth took his hand. "George, this is not your fault. I should have seen it, and I should have seen Miranda's machinations before she destroyed my reputation. But victims can't always see their predators. That's what makes predators successful." George looked at their joined hands. "If Edmund did what I suspect, I don't know if I can forgive him. You don't have to, but you deserve to know the full truth. And Catherine deserves to have her story told correctly. Even if it costs us everything? Especially then. I've lived under the weight of lies for 3 years. I won't start our marriage with more lies, even to protect ourselves." George looked at her with something that might have been wonder. "You're remarkable, Ruth." "I'm angry. There's a difference." "No, they're often the same thing." A commotion in the entrance hall shattered the moment. Raised voices, a servant's protest. The study door opened. "Your Grace, Lady Miranda Hartley has arrived, uninvited, demanding to see you." George's expression hardened. "Show her in. Let's end this now." Miranda swept in, beautifully dressed in crimson silk, her confidence absolute. "Your Grace, I must speak with you privately about a matter of grave importance regarding your upcoming marriage. Anything you have to say can be said in front of Lady Ruth." Miranda's eyes flickered to Ruth, and hatred flashed there. "Very well. I've come to warn you that Lady Ruth is not what she seems. Her scandal 3 years ago," Ruth stepped forward, "was orchestrated by you, Lady Miranda, and we know it." Miranda recovered quickly. "I don't know what lies she's told you." "The servants you paid to testify against Lady Ruth," George said coldly. "We've found them. They've confessed to perjury. It was a bluff," but Miranda paled. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Ruth felt strength surge through her. "You underestimated how thoroughly the Duke investigates his enemies, Lady Miranda. A mistake on your part." Miranda turned to George. "Your Grace, even if that were true, I have information about your late wife that you would not want made public." "You mean Catherine's suicide? I'm planning to announce it myself tomorrow." Miranda's composure cracked. You can't. It will ruin your family." "My family was ruined the moment my brother drove my wife to take her own life. I'm simply acknowledging reality." Miranda's mask fell away entirely, venom in her voice. "Fine. Marry your ruined woman, but don't think this is over. I'll ensure every ballroom in London knows exactly what kind of duchess she'll make." Ruth met her gaze calmly. "You've already done your worst to me, Lady Miranda. I survived. I'll survive whatever else you attempt. We'll see about that." She stormed out, her crimson silk billowing like blood. Ruth found herself trembling. "She'll try something at the wedding. I know she will." George took her shoulders gently. "Let her try. We'll be ready." "How can you be so calm?" "Because I've learned something important this past week, Ruth." "What?" "That fighting beside someone is far more powerful than fighting alone. We face her together." At her carriage, George did something unexpected. He took her hand and kissed it, but lingered, his lips warm against her glove. "6 more days until you're my duchess. Can you endure 6 more days of war?" Ruth looked up at this complex, damaged man who'd offered her not rescue but partnership. "I can endure anything, Your Grace. The question is, can you endure a duchess who insists on fighting her own battles?" George smiled, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his severe features. "I'm counting on it, Lady Ruth." As Ruth's carriage disappeared into the London night, George stood alone in the lamplight, feeling something he hadn't felt since before Catherine's death hope. And in her carriage, Ruth touched the place where his lips had pressed against her hand, wondering if a marriage that began as alliance might somehow become something more. But first, they had a war to win. Chapter 6. The Truth Unearthed. 3 days before the wedding, Colonel Whitfield returned from Brighton with Dr. Carlyle in tow. Ruth was in George's study when they arrived. She'd taken to spending her afternoons there, helping him sort through Catherine's correspondence for any clues about Miranda's involvement. It felt strange, intimate even, to handle the dead woman's letters, to see her delicate handwriting, to glimpse the fragile mind behind the words. George had been right. Catherine had been unwell. Her letters spoke of dark moods, of days spent unable to leave her bed, of a persistent melancholy that no amount of sunlight or society could cure. But there was also sweetness in them, love for George, expressed in tentative phrases, hope for their future, plans for children, for a garden she wanted to create, for a life that had been stolen from her. Ruth was reading one such letter when Matthews announced, "Your Grace, Colonel Whitfield has returned." With a guest, George stood immediately, his military bearings snapping into place. "Show them in." Dr. Carlyle was older than Ruth expected, perhaps 60, with grey hair and a worn face that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He entered the study like a man walking to the gallows, his eyes downcast, his shoulders hunched. Colonel Whitfield looked grim. "Found him exactly where your brother said. Ashford. Didn't take much convincing once I mentioned Lady Catherine's name. I think he's been waiting 2 years for someone to ask questions." The doctor's hands trembled as he took the seat George indicated. Ruth remained in her chair by the window, quiet but present. George had insisted she be part of everything now. No more secrets, no more shadows. "Dr. Carlyle." George's voice was cold, controlled. "You know why you're here." "Yes, Your Grace." The doctor's voice cracked. "I've known this day would come. I've dreaded it, but perhaps I've also hoped for it. Tell me how my wife really died." Dr. Carlyle closed his eyes. "She took laudanum, Your Grace. A lethal dose. When I arrived, she was already gone. There was nothing I could do." Ruth watched George's jaw tighten, the only visible sign of his emotion. "Was there a child?" Ruth asked gently. The doctor opened his eyes, looking at her with surprise, then gratitude for the softer question. "She was with child. Yes, my lady. Perhaps 3 months along, but the laudanum killed them both. And my brother Edmund paid you to record it as childbirth complications." George's statement held no question. "He did, Your Grace. £500 and passage to Brighton. He said it was to protect the family name, that a suicide would bring scandal and ruin. That your grief would be easier to bear if you believed she died trying to bring your child into the world rather than—" He trailed off. "Rather than choosing to leave me." George's voice was flat. "I'm sorry, Your Grace. It was wrong of me. I knew it then, and I've known it every day since. But I was in debt, and the money. I took the coward's path." George paced to the window, staring out at the London street below. Ruth could see the rigid control in every line of his body, the war he waged against his own emotions. "Did Catherine tell you anything before she died?" Ruth asked. "Leave any message?" "There were 2 letters, my lady. One, His Grace received. But there was another, addressed to her mother, the Dowager Countess of Bramfield." George spun around. "What happened to that letter?" "Your brother took it, Your Grace. He said he would deliver it personally. I assumed he did." George and Ruth exchanged looks. Edmund had never delivered that letter. He'd hidden it, destroyed it perhaps, to protect himself. "What did the letter say?" George's voice was dangerously quiet. "Did you read it?" Dr. Carlyle's face flushed with shame. I confess I glanced at it, Your Grace. I know I shouldn't have, but I was trying to understand, to see if there was anything I could do." "What did it say?" George repeated. "Lady Catherine wrote about an assault." The doctor's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She wrote that your brother Edmund had forced himself upon her while you were in London. She couldn't bear the shame of it, or the uncertainty about the child she carried. She didn't know if it was yours or his." The room fell into absolute silence. Ruth watched George turn back to the window, his hands clenched behind his back. She could see the tremor in them, the only outward sign of the fury and grief warring inside him. Colonel Whitfield broke the silence, his voice hard. "That bastard. I'll kill him myself." "No." George's word cracked like a whip. "He's mine." He turned back to face them, and Ruth felt her breath catch at the expression on his face. Not rage, that would have been easier to witness. This was something colder, more terrible. Absolute, implacable judgment. "Where is my brother now?" George asked Matthews, who'd remained silent in the corner. "Still at his club, Your Grace. He's been staying away from the house since the dinner party." "Good. That gives us time." George walked to his desk, began pulling out papers with military precision. "Dr. Carlyle, you will write a full confession of what you've just told us. Every detail. Sign it, date it. Colonel Whitfield will serve as witness. Your Grace, if I do this, I could lose my license. Face criminal charges. You should have thought of that before you took my brother's money." George's voice was ice. "But if you testify truthfully, I'll ensure you face no legal consequences. You'll simply retire from practice quietly. Refuse, and I'll see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law." Dr. Carlyle sagged with relief. "Thank you, Your Grace. I'll tell the truth, all of it." As the doctor began to write, George turned to Ruth. "Are you certain you want to be part of this? What comes next will be brutal." Ruth stood, crossed to him, placed her hand on his arm. "I've survived brutal before, and this time I'm not alone." Something shifted in George's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening. "No, you're not." The confession took an hour to write. Dr. Carlyle's hand shook so badly that the writing was almost illegible in places, but every word was there. The assault, the pregnancy, Catherine's despair, the suicide, Edmund's bribe, the falsified death certificate. George read it 3 times, his face growing progressively colder. "This is what we needed," he said finally. "The truth, documented and witnessed. Now we use it." "How?" Ruth asked. "We make Edmund confess publicly, at an event where he can't escape, where his words will be witnessed by people who matter." Colonel Whitfield frowned. "That's bold, Your Grace, and dangerous. So is marrying while this sword hangs over our heads." George looked at Ruth. "There's a ball tomorrow night. Lady Pemberton is hosting. Half of London's elite will be there." Ruth felt ice form in her veins. "You want to expose Edmund at a ball, the night before our wedding? I want to clear the air before we marry. No secrets, no leverage for Miranda or anyone else to use against us." George's grey eyes held hers. "But I won't do it without your agreement. This will affect you as much as me." Ruth thought of 3 years in corners, 3 years of whispers and shame for crimes she didn't commit. And here was George, offering to expose his own family's darkest secrets to give both of them freedom from manipulation. "How do we ensure Edmund confesses in front of witnesses?" George's smile was cold and strategic. "We use what Miranda taught you. We manipulate the scene. We make him believe confession is his only escape." The next day passed in tense preparation. George met with Lord Pemberton, requesting permission to make an announcement at the ball. Ruth endured fittings for her wedding dress, trying not to think about what might happen before she ever wore it. Sarah noticed her distraction. "My lady, you seem troubled. Are you having doubts about the Duke?" "No." Ruth was surprised by how certain she sounded. "No doubts about him, only about tomorrow night." "What happens tomorrow night?" Ruth met her maid's eyes in the mirror. "Either freedom or ruin. I'm not entirely sure which." That evening, Ruth chose her gown with care. Not the sapphire blue George preferred, but a deeper shade midnight blue silk that was almost black, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like stars. A bridge between her past in mourning and her future in color. When George saw her, something flickered in his expression. "You look like vengeance itself, Lady Ruth." "Good. That's rather how I feel." The Pemberton ballroom glittered with London's finest. Ruth stood at George's side, her hand on his arm, feeling every eye upon them. The scandalous engagement was still the talk of society, the cold Duke and the ruined lady, an alliance that made no sense to those who valued only appearance over substance. Let them stare. Ruth had learned to wear scrutiny like armor. Edmund was already present, drinking champagne with forced gaiety. He saw them enter and paled visibly, but couldn't escape without making a scene. George had timed it perfectly. At 10 o'clock, he signaled the orchestra to stop. The music died into silence, and every face turned toward the Duke of Ashford. "Ladies and gentlemen," George's voice carried to every corner of the ballroom, commanding and cold, "I apologize for interrupting the evening's festivities, but I have a matter of family honor that must be addressed publicly." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruth felt her heart pound but kept her expression serene. 2 years ago, my wife, Lady Catherine Alfred, died. Society was told she died of childbirth complications. That was a lie. Gasps erupted. Fans fluttered wildly. Somewhere, a woman whispered, "Good God." George continued, relentless. Lady Catherine took her own life. She left a note explaining why. "I have hidden this truth to protect my family's reputation, but I will hide it no longer." Ruth saw Edmund pushing through the crowd, panic on his face. "George, don't do this, please." "Why shouldn't I, brother? Give me one good reason." Edmund's voice cracked. "Because it will destroy us. Think of father's legacy, the family name." "I'm thinking of Catherine, the woman you destroyed." The ballroom erupted in shocked conversation. Ruth scanned the crowd and spotted Miranda, her face a mask of fury. Their eyes met, and Miranda's expression promised retribution. But George wasn't finished. "My wife killed herself because she was assaulted," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "While I was in London conducting estate business, someone violated her in her own home. The shame and trauma drove her to take laudanum. She was 3 months pregnant when she died, uncertain if the child was mine or her rapist's." The ballroom fell into horrified silence. Dr. Carlyle, the physician who attended her, falsified the death certificate at the behest of the rapist. "Dr. Carlyle, would you confirm this?" The doctor stepped forward from where he'd been waiting at the edge of the crowd. "Yes, Your Grace. I was paid to record it as childbirth complications. I deeply regret my role in the deception." Edmund tried to reach the exit. Colonel Whitfield, positioned strategically, blocked his path. George's voice was implacable. "Going somewhere, Edmund? I won't stay here and listen to this. You'll stay and answer for what you did." George produced a letter, the one Catherine had written to her mother. "Catherine wrote a second letter before she died, naming you explicitly as her attacker. That letter was never delivered. You took it and hid it, but I found it among your belongings. It was a lie. They'd never found the original letter." But Edmund didn't know that. The color drained from Edmund's face. His legs seemed to give way. "George," Ruth stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Mr. Alfred, you have a choice. Confess truthfully here and now, or that letter will be read aloud to everyone present, including detailed descriptions of what you did." Edmund looked around wildly, seeing no escape, no sympathy, only horrified faces and condemning eyes. He broke. "It wasn't. I didn't mean." He collapsed to his knees, sobbing. "Catherine was so beautiful, and George was always gone, and I thought she wanted, but she didn't. She fought me, and I couldn't stop myself." Women in the crowd began to weep. Men looked murderous. Edmund continued, the words pouring out in a rush. "I'm sorry. I've been sorry every day since. When she died, I thought I'd go mad with guilt. I paid the doctor to hide it because I couldn't bear for anyone to know what I'd done." George stood over his brother, towering and terrible. "You're sorry. My wife is dead, and you're sorry. George, please, I'm your brother." "You are no brother of mine." George's voice could have frozen fire. "As of this moment, you are disinherited. You will leave England tonight. If you ever return, I will see you prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and if you refuse to leave voluntarily, I will kill you myself." Edmund collapsed completely, weeping. "George, remove him from my sight." Colonel Whitfield and 2 footmen dragged Edmund from the ballroom. His sobs echoed long after he disappeared. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then Miranda pushed forward, her beautiful face twisted with malice. "This is all very dramatic, Your Grace, but you've conveniently left out your own role in this tragedy. You left your young wife alone and vulnerable. You failed to protect her." The words struck where they were meant to. Ruth saw George flinch, saw the guilt flash across his face. Miranda pressed her advantage. "And now you're marrying another damaged woman, Lady Ruth, the ruined girl in black. Are you collecting broken things, Your Grace, to assuage your guilt for the one you couldn't save?" The ballroom murmured. Miranda had struck a nerve with the crowd. There was truth enough in her words to wound. But before George could respond, Ruth stepped forward. "Lady Miranda, since you've chosen to make this personal, let's discuss broken things." Ruth's voice rang clear as a bell. 3 years ago, you orchestrated my ruin. You forged love letters, paid servants to lie, and destroyed my engagement to your brother because it didn't serve your purposes. Miranda's confident expression faltered. "That's a lie." "Is it?" Then why did you send me threatening letters with your distinctive crimson seal, warning me to stay away from the Duke? Why have you spent 3 years ensuring I remained socially dead? George produced the letters. We have the letters, Lady Miranda, and we have testimony from the servants you paid. Would you like me to read them aloud? Miranda's composure shattered. I was protecting His Grace from making a terrible mistake. Lady Ruth is beneath him. No, Ruth said quietly. You wanted him for yourself. You were obsessed with becoming his Duchess. When your friendship with Catherine didn't produce the result you wanted, you looked for other paths. My engagement to your brother threatened your social positioning, so you destroyed me. And when the Duke showed interest in me despite my ruined reputation, you tried to destroy that too. Miranda lost control completely. He should have been mine. I was Catherine's friend. I was there for him in his grief. Not you, some pathetic woman in black who doesn't even have the dignity to disappear completely. The ballroom fell silent, appalled by the raw venom in her voice. Lady Pemberton, their hostess, stepped forward. Lady Miranda, I think you should leave. Miranda looked around wildly, seeing the condemnation on every face. She fled, her crimson gown billowing like blood behind her. The silence that followed was profound. Then Lord Harrington, an influential peer, approached George. Your Grace, that took extraordinary courage. It took too long, George said quietly. I should have faced the truth 2 years ago. Other guests began to approach, some offering condolences, others respect for his honesty. The mood in the ballroom shifted from scandal-hungry to something more complex. Sympathy for Catherine, horror at Edmund's crime, grudging respect for George's willingness to expose his family's darkest secrets rather than live under the threat of blackmail, and curiosity about Ruth, the woman who stood beside the cold Duke, no longer invisible, no longer silent. Lady Thornton approached, her expression softer than Ruth had ever seen it. Lady Ruth, I may have misjudged you. Both of you. The truth has a way of changing perspectives, Lady Thornton. After an hour of well-wishers and gossips, Lady Pemberton announced that the ball would continue. The orchestra began playing again, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. George turned to Ruth. Will you dance with me, Lady Ruth, properly this time without commands or orders? I will, Your Grace. This time, the waltz was different. Not a declaration of war, but something softer, more fragile. As they moved across the floor, Ruth felt the tension slowly draining from George's rigid shoulders. Miranda was right about one thing, he said quietly. I did fail Catherine. I wasn't there when she needed protection. You were conducting your ducal duties. You couldn't have known what Edmund would do. I should have known. I should have seen his nature, should have protected her better. Ruth looked up into his grey eyes. George, listen to me. Predators are skilled at hiding their nature. You cannot blame yourself for not seeing what he deliberately concealed. Edmund is responsible for Edmund's actions, not you. When I proposed to you, I said I wanted someone who understood isolation, George said, his voice raw. But the truth is, I wanted someone who wouldn't expect me to be whole. Because I'm not whole, Ruth. I'm damaged, broken. Neither am I, Ruth interrupted. We're both damaged, George, but perhaps together we can be something better than we are alone. George looked at her with unexpected tenderness. You're stronger than you know. So are you. You just faced your greatest shame publicly. That's not weakness, George. That's courage. I'm terrified of failing you as I failed Catherine. Ruth stopped dancing, placed her hand on his cheek. Then don't. Be present. Be honest. That's all I ask. The music swirled around them, but they stood still in the center of the ballroom, holding each other's gaze. Then George did something unexpected. He raised Ruth's hand to his lips and kissed it, not formally, but tenderly, lingeringly. 2 more days until you're my Duchess, he said softly. Are you still certain you want this broken man? I'm certain I want the man who had the courage to tell the truth, even when it cost him everything. That's not broken, George. That's honorable. Around them, the ballroom whispered and watched. But for the first time, the whispers didn't matter to either of them. As George led Ruth from the ballroom into the cool night air, both felt the weight of secrets finally lifted. The war wasn't entirely won. Miranda would recover and scheme again. Society would gossip for months, and the ghost of Catherine would take time to lay to rest. But they had faced the darkness together and emerged still standing. In 2 days, they would marry. And for the first time, both began to believe that marriage might be more than survival. It might be salvation. Chapter 7. The Wedding Day. Ruth woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, the last time she would wake in this room, in this house, as Ruth Louis, instead of the Duchess of Ashford. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Anticipation. Sarah was already bustling about, preparing the bath, laying out the wedding gown with reverent hands. "Good morning, my lady. Or should I practice saying your grace?" Ruth sat up, her heart fluttering. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm not a duchess until the vicar says so. He'll say so." Sarah's smile was knowing. "I saw the way his grace looked at you at the ball, like you were the only person in the world." The bath was scented with roses, the water hot and soothing. Ruth let herself sink into it, trying to calm her racing thoughts. In a few hours, she would marry George Alfred, the cold Duke of War, a man she'd known for barely 2 weeks but who somehow understood her better than people she'd known her entire life. A man who'd stood before all of London and confessed his family's darkest secrets rather than let them be used as weapons against her. A man who'd said, in front of hundreds of witnesses, that he loved her. The door opened and Ruth's mother entered, her face uncharacteristically soft. Lady Constance had been crying, her eyes were red-rimmed, her handkerchief clutched in one hand. "Mama?" Lady Constance sat on the edge of the tub, a gesture so informal it shocked Ruth. Her mother had always been rigid about propriety, about maintaining proper distance. "Ruth, I owe you an apology," her voice cracked. "Your father and we were so concerned with appearances that we forgot to fight for your innocence." Ruth went very still. "Mama, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Lady Constance's tears began to fall in earnest. "When the scandal happened, we should have stood by you, demanded proof, defended you. Instead, we buried you in black and told you to be grateful for invitations. We made you invisible because it was easier than fighting for the truth." Ruth felt her own tears rising. "I thought you believed I was guilty." "Never." Her mother took her hand. "I knew you, Ruth. I knew you would never do what they accused you of. But I was a coward. I was more afraid of society's judgment than I was loyal to my own daughter. I'm sorry. I'm so terribly sorry." Ruth pulled her mother into an embrace, both women crying now. 3 years of pain and loneliness seemed to crack open, releasing something that felt almost like forgiveness. "I love you, Mama," Ruth whispered. "I love you too, my darling girl. And I'm so proud of you, of your strength, your courage. You're going to be a magnificent duchess." St. George's, Hanover Square, was the most fashionable church in London, and today it was packed to capacity. Everyone who was anyone wanted to witness this wedding. The cold Duke of War marrying the ruined lady, just 2 days after exposing his own family's scandal at the Pemberton ball. Inside, George stood at the altar beside Colonel Whitfield, forcing himself to breathe steadily. He'd faced enemy fire without flinching, had commanded troops through impossible battles, had stared down death more times than he could count. But this terrified him in a way war never had. "Steady, Ashford." Whitfield's gruff voice held affection. "She'll be here. What if I fail her as I failed Catherine?" The words escaped before George could stop them. Whitfield turned to face him fully. "You won't, because you're aware of the possibility. That makes all the difference. Catherine's death wasn't your fault, but you've learned from it. You'll be present this time. Aware. That's what Ruth needs." The organ began to play. George's breath caught as Ruth appeared at the end of the aisle. She was radiant in ivory silk, embroidered with delicate silver thread that caught the light like starlight. Her auburn hair was dressed elegantly, woven with small white roses. No black, no shadows, just Ruth, luminous and real. As she walked toward him on her father's arm, George felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't Catherine delicate, fragile Catherine who'd needed protection. Ruth was strong, fierce, a survivor. She didn't need him to save her. She needed him to stand beside her as an equal. Lord William stopped at the altar, looking at his daughter with an expression George couldn't quite read. "You look beautiful, Ruth, like the daughter I remember from before everything." Ruth's smile was gentle but firm. "That daughter is gone, Father, but perhaps this new version is better." She turned to George, and the rest of the church seemed to fade away. "Still certain about this alliance, Your Grace?" she whispered. George felt the hint of a smile tug at his lips. "More certain than I've been about anything in years." The vicar began the ceremony, his voice sonorous and formal. George barely heard the words. He was too focused on Ruth's hand in his, warm and steady, her grey-green eyes holding his with such trust, it made his chest ache. If anyone present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, the church doors burst open with a crash. Lady Miranda Hartley stood in the entrance, her hair dishevelled, her gown, the same crimson one she'd worn to the ball, crumpled and stained. She looked like a woman who hadn't slept in 2 days. "I object to this marriage." Gasps rippled through the congregation. George felt Ruth tense beside him, but kept his own expression coldly neutral. The vicar stammered, "Lady Miranda, unless you have legal grounds—" "I have moral grounds." Miranda's voice was shrill, hysterical. "This woman is ruined. She's using the Duke to restore her reputation. She's a scheming, manipulative—" "Lady Miranda," George's voice cut through her tirade like a blade, "you will leave immediately, or I will have you forcibly removed." But Miranda was beyond reason, beyond strategy. She'd lost everything: her carefully constructed plans, her reputation, her hope of becoming a duchess. She had nothing left to lose. "You think you've won?" She laughed, the sound edging toward madness. "Both of you? I made Ruth what she is. I destroyed her once, and I can do it again. I have connections. I have influence." Ruth stepped forward, and George felt a surge of pride at the calm strength in her bearing. "No, Miranda," Ruth said quietly. "You can't, because I'm not the terrified girl you destroyed 3 years ago. I've survived your worst. I have nothing left to fear from you." "The Duke doesn't love you," Miranda shrieked. "He's marrying you out of guilt. You're just a replacement for his dead wife. You'll always be second to Catherine's ghost." The church held its collective breath. George stepped beside Ruth, took her hand. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the church. "You're wrong, Lady Miranda. I'm marrying Ruth because she's the strongest person I've ever met, because she understands darkness and chooses light anyway. Because she's not Catherine, she's herself, and that's exactly who I want." He turned to Ruth, saw her eyes widen with shock and something that looked like wonder. "I didn't expect to feel this way," he continued, no longer caring that hundreds of people were watching. "This was supposed to be a practical arrangement, but somewhere between the corner of that ballroom and this altar, I fell in love with you, Ruth. With your strength, your courage, your refusal to disappear even when the world told you to." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "You love me?" "I do, and I'm terrified of it, but I'm more terrified of losing you." "You won't lose me." Ruth's voice was steady despite her tears. "I'm here. I choose this. I choose you." Behind them, Miranda began to weep harsh, broken sobs. Lady Pemberton and 2 footmen appeared at her sides, gently but firmly escorting her from the church. The vicar cleared his throat. "Well, shall we? Shall we continue?" The ceremony proceeded, but the energy had transformed entirely. George's vows were steady, clear, weighted with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Ruth's voice rang out strong and certain. When the vicar finally pronounced them husband and wife, George pulled Ruth close and kissed her, not the chaste formal kiss expected at weddings, but deeply, thoroughly, claiming her as his with an intensity that made several older ladies gasp. The church erupted in applause. Ruth pulled back, breathless, her cheeks flushed. "That was quite a kiss for a practical arrangement, Your Grace." George smiled, a real smile that felt foreign but wonderful on his face. "I'm revising the terms of our agreement, Your Grace. I hope you'll accept the amendments." "I'll consider them," Ruth said, her eyes sparkling. Ashford House had been transformed for the wedding breakfast. Flowers everywhere, white roses, cream peonies, trailing ivy. Light streamed through the windows, making everything glow. It was nothing like the shadowy, grief-stricken house Ruth had visited before. It looked like hope. The Tun had turned out in force, and the breakfast was a curious mix of genuine celebration and barely disguised gossip. But Ruth found she no longer cared what they whispered. She was the Duchess of Ashford now. Let them talk. Colonel Whitfield raised his glass. "To the Duke and Duchess of Ashford. May they always fight together, not apart." Lord Harrington followed. "To truth and courage, rare commodities in our world." And then Lady Thornton, surprisingly, stood. "To the Duchess who refused to disappear. May we all learn from her strength." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected tribute. An hour into the breakfast, George leaned close. "Come with me." He pulled her away from the crowd, down a corridor, into his private study. The moment the door closed, he pulled her into his arms. Disappearing from our own wedding breakfast, Ruth teased. What will people say? I don't care. George's voice was rough. I needed a moment alone with my wife. The word wife sent warmth flooding through her. Ruth, what I said in the church. I meant it. I know this isn't what we originally agreed. George, Ruth placed her fingers over his lips. I love you too. He went very still. You do. I didn't expect to. I thought I was too broken, too damaged to love anyone again. But you saw me when I was invisible. You chose me when no one else would. And you gave me back myself. George's arms tightened around her. I'm still afraid. Of failing you. Of my demons. Of not being enough. Then we'll be afraid together. Ruth looked up at him. And we'll fight through it together. Catherine's ghost. We'll always be part of your past. Ruth's voice was gentle but firm. I don't expect you to forget her or stop grieving, but make room for me too. For us. I want to. George's voice broke. God, I want to. Ruth took his face in her hands. Then do. Choose to live, George. With me. Fully. He kissed her again, and this time it was different. Not duty, not alliance, but love. Pure, terrifying, exhilarating love. A knock interrupted them. Matthews entered, looking apologetic. Your Grace, there's been an incident. Mr. Edmund Alfred was found at the docks, attempting to board a ship to France. He's been arrested on charges related to Lady Catherine's death. George stiffened. Arrested? By whom? The magistrate, Your Grace. Apparently Catherine's mother, the Dowager Countess of Bramfield, filed formal charges after reading her daughter's letter. She demands justice. Ruth felt George's conflict in the tension of his body. What will happen to him? Trial, Your Grace. Possibly transportation to Australia, or worse. After Matthews left, George stood silent, wrestling with emotions Ruth could only imagine. What do you want to do? She asked quietly. He's my brother. Part of me wants him to hang. Part of me. He's still my brother. Ruth took his hand. You can show mercy without forgiveness. They're not the same thing. What would you do? Ruth considered. I would ensure justice for Catherine. She deserves that. But I would also ensure Edmund faces consequences that include exile and shame, not necessarily death. Sometimes living with what you've done is a harsher punishment than dying. George nodded slowly. I'll speak to the magistrate. Request transportation rather than hanging. He'll be gone from England forever, alive but punished. They returned to the breakfast hand in hand, presenting a united front. The guests noticed the change. George no longer looked like the cold Duke of War. He looked like a man in love with his wife. Ruth glanced around the room. Just weeks ago, she'd stood in corners wearing black, invisible and forgotten. Now she was the Duchess of Ashford, wearing ivory, standing in the center of everything. Not because someone commanded her to, but because she chose to. George led her onto the floor for their first dance as husband and wife. The guests formed a circle, watching with varying degrees of approval, curiosity, and envy. Remember when I ordered you to dance with me? George whispered. How could I forget? You were terrifying. Was I? Utterly. But also, you were the first person in 3 years who looked at me like I existed. George's arms tightened around her. You've always existed, Ruth. They were just blind. And you weren't? I was looking for someone who understood ghosts. George's voice was soft. I found someone who taught me to live again instead. The music swelled, the dance ended, and they were announced departing for the country estate. In the carriage, finally alone, Ruth leaned against George's shoulder, exhausted and exhilarated in equal measure. We did it, she said. We survived our own wedding. We did more than survive. We won. What did we win? George kissed the top of her head. Each other. The truth. A future. And what does that future look like? I don't know. But for the first time in years, I'm not afraid to find out. As the carriage rolled through London streets toward the countryside beyond, the cold Duke of War held his Duchess close, and the woman who had been told to wear black forever allowed herself to believe in colour again. Behind them, the ballrooms and corners of London continued their endless social dance. But ahead, in the quiet of the country estate, 2 wounded souls would begin the harder, more beautiful work of healing together. Gagag BQN. Chapter 8. The Resurrection. 6 months later, winter had settled over the Ashford country estate like a benediction, transforming the grounds into a landscape of white silence. Snow clung to bare tree branches, blanketed the gardens, muffled the world into peaceful stillness. Ruth woke to sunlight streaming through the windows of the Duchess's chambers, turning the frost on the glass into diamonds. She stretched languidly, savoring the warmth of the bed, the softness of the morning. She wore a soft blue morning gown. No black, never black again. Her hand drifted to her abdomen, feeling the slight swell there that had only recently become visible. 3 months along, a child growing inside her, George's child. Their future, alive and real. The door to George's adjoining chamber opened, and he entered already dressed for riding, dark coat, buff breeches, boots still gleaming despite the winter weather. He looked vigorous, healthy, so different from the frozen man she'd first met. Then he saw where her hand rested, and he froze. The fear in his eyes was immediate, visceral. Ruth saw Catherine's ghost rise between them like a spectre. "George," she kept her voice gentle but firm. "Come here." He approached slowly, as if walking toward a precipice, his usual confidence stripped away by terror. Ruth took his hand and placed it on her stomach, covering it with her own. "Feel that. That's our child, alive and growing, and I am healthy and strong." Catherine was healthy too. George's voice was raw, until she wasn't. Ruth had expected this. They'd discussed it when she'd first told him about the pregnancy, and periodically since. But knowing it was coming didn't make it easier to witness his fear. "I'm not Catherine, George. We've discussed this." "I know, but when I think about childbirth, about losing you, then don't think about losing me." Ruth's voice turned firm, the steel she'd learned to wield showing through. "Think about our child. Think about the future. You can't live in fear of Catherine's fate forever." George pulled away, crossed to the window, stared out at the snow-covered grounds. "What if I can't protect you?" "You can't. Not from everything." Ruth rose, went to him, placed a hand on his rigid back. "But you can be present. You can be here with me, not trapped in the past." George sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I'm trying. God knows I'm trying." Ruth knelt beside him, taking his face in her hands. "I know you are, and I love you for it. But George, you have to trust me. Trust my strength." "I do trust you." "Then trust me when I say I'm not afraid." Ruth's voice was steady, certain. "I have the best doctors, your support, and more importantly, I have the will to survive. I didn't survive 3 years in corners to die in childbirth." George's laugh was shaky, but genuine. "You're fierce, Your Grace," Ruth smiled. "I learned from my husband, the Duke of War." Later that afternoon, George led Ruth to a part of the estate she'd never visited, a secluded garden behind the east wing, surrounded by high stone walls that blocked the wind. In the center stood a marble memorial stone, simple and elegant. Catherine's name was engraved with her dates and a single line, "Beloved wife, taken too soon, forever remembered." "You've never brought me here before," Ruth said quietly. "I wasn't ready." George stared at the memorial, his expression unreadable. "This was my place to hide from the world, to be alone with my grief. And now I want to share it with you. All of me, even the parts that hurt." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes at the trust implicit in the gesture. She knelt, placed the flowers she'd brought, white roses, Catherine's favorite according to the servants, at the base of the stone. "Catherine," Ruth said softly, "I never knew you, but I'm grateful for what you taught George about love, even if it ended in tragedy. I promise to honor your memory by loving him well." George made a choked sound. "Ruth," she stood, took his hand. "She was part of your life, George. I won't erase that, but I also won't let her ghost dictate our future. I kept this garden frozen in time," George said, his voice thick with emotion, "like I kept myself frozen. And now I want to live." He pulled her close. "With you, for our child." They stood together in the winter garden, the past acknowledged, the future embraced. Back at the house, Matthews waited with a letter. "From Australia, Your Grace. From your brother." George took it with visible reluctance. Ruth settled beside him on the sofa in the library as he broke the seal and read aloud. "Brother, I am writing from my exile to say what I should have said years ago. I'm sorry, not just for Catherine, but for the man I was weak, entitled, monstrous. Transportation has given me time to think about what I destroyed. I don't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I want you to know that I live every day with the weight of my actions. I hope you've found some peace. I hope you've learned to love again. You deserve that, even if I don't." Edmund. Silence filled the library. "Will you write back?" Ruth asked. George stared at the letter. "I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me never wants to think about him again. There's no rush to decide." Ruth leaned against his shoulder. "Some wounds take years to heal. Do you ever think about Miranda?" George asked suddenly. "About what she did to you?" Ruth considered. "Sometimes. But then I remember that her attempts to destroy me ultimately led me to you. Her malice, ironically, gave me my greatest gift." George pressed a kiss to her temple. "You're more generous than I am." "Not generous, just grateful. I have everything she wanted, and I didn't have to scheme or destroy to get it." "I heard she fled to the continent," George said. "No family will receive her after her behavior at our wedding." "I almost pity her," Ruth said. "She was so consumed by wanting what others had that she destroyed herself." The following afternoon brought unexpected visitors. Matthews announced Lady Thornton and several society ladies, all dressed in their finest afternoon gowns. Ruth received them in the drawing room, settling into her role as Duchess with increasing confidence. These were the same women who had once whispered about her, pitied her, looked through her as if she didn't exist. Now they sought her favor. "Your Grace," Lady Thornton began after pleasantries were exchanged, "we're organizing a charity for women who've been falsely accused of impropriety. We were hoping you might serve as patroness." Ruth studied the older woman, understanding the irony immediately. "You want me, the woman you all whispered about, to be the face of this charity?" Lady Thornton had the grace to look embarrassed. "We want the woman who survived scandal with grace and strength. You're an inspiration, Your Grace." Ruth felt something shift in her chest. Purpose, not just survival, but meaning. "I accept," she said. "On one condition. We don't just help women clear their names, we help them build new lives, whether they're vindicated or not. Because sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes you have to free yourself." That evening, George and Ruth hosted a small ball at the estate. Nothing like the grand London affairs, but intimate and warm. Local gentry, a few close friends, the warmth of community rather than the cold calculation of society. George led Ruth onto the floor for the opening dance, and she smiled up at him. "Do you remember the first time we danced?" "I ordered you," George said, with a hint of chagrin. "Quite rudely, if I recall. You terrified me. And now? Now you're just my husband." Ruth's eyes sparkled. "Still terrifying, but in different ways." George laughed, a sound that had become more frequent over the past months. "I don't think I've ever been called just a husband before." As they waltzed, Ruth felt it, a flutter inside her, like butterfly wings. She gasped, stopping mid-step. "George," I felt the baby move. He went very still. "You did?" Ruth guided his hand to her abdomen. "Wait. There. Did you feel it?" Wonder dawned in George's eyes as he felt the small movement beneath his palm. "I did. That's our child. That's our future, alive and real." Around them, the other dancers had stopped, watching the Duke and Duchess in their moment of private joy made public. George didn't care. He pulled Ruth close and kissed her in the middle of the ballroom, thoroughly and tenderly. Applause erupted around them. Later, Ruth showed George the nursery she'd been preparing in secret. She'd chosen a room with southern exposure, filled with light. The walls were painted in soft yellows and greens, nothing dark, nothing morbid. Everything spoke of hope. "It's beautiful," George said, his voice thick. "Hopeful. That's what our child should be. Hope, not fear. What if I'm not a good father?" The old fear surfaced. "What if I'm too damaged?" Ruth took his hands. "Then you'll be a damaged father who loves his child fiercely. That's enough." "Is it?" "It's more than enough. Love and presence. That's all children need." George pulled her close. "I've been thinking about names." "Have you?" "If it's a girl, I'd like to name her Catherine Ruth. Catherine for my first wife, Ruth for my current one, honoring the past while embracing the present." Ruth felt tears well up at the gesture. "And if it's a boy? I thought William, after your father. He's been surprisingly supportive since the wedding." "He respects strength," Ruth said. "You showed him strength. We showed him strength, together." 6 months later. A summer storm raged outside Ashford House while inside, Ruth labored to bring their child into the world. George was present, holding her hand, terrified but refusing to leave despite the midwife's protests. "Your Grace, the Duke should wait outside." "No." Ruth's voice was firm even through the pain. "He stays. I commanded it." George almost smiled at her use of his own authoritative phrase from that first night. Hours passed. Pain, fear, exhaustion, but also strength, determination, love. Then, a baby's cry. "A girl, Your Grace." The midwife's voice was jubilant. Healthy and strong. George saw his daughter, tiny, red-faced, perfect. Then Ruth, exhausted but smiling, both alive, both well. He broke down, weeping with relief and joy and gratitude. Ruth reached for him. "See, I told you I was strong enough. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." They named her Catherine Ruth Alfred, as planned. George held his daughter, held his wife, and finally released the last of his fear, 1 year after the birth. The ballroom at Ashford House in London glittered with candlelight and jewels. Ruth descended the grand staircase in a crimson gown, the colour of Miranda's threatening seal, reclaimed and transformed. Her auburn hair was dressed magnificently, woven with garnets that matched her dress. Upstairs, little Catherine slept peacefully under her nurse's watchful eye. George waited at the bottom of the stairs, still commanding, still the Duke of War in bearing, but his eyes were warm as he watched his wife descend. "You're wearing red. I thought it was time to reclaim that colour." Ruth smiled. "It was used to threaten me once. Now it's just beautiful. Everything about you is beautiful." The ballroom was full, the ton in all its glory, gossiping and dancing and scheming as always. But Ruth was no longer relegated to corners. She was the Duchess of Ashford, respected, admired, even beloved by some. A young woman approached hesitantly, wearing grey, not quite black, but close. She was perhaps 20, with the haunted eyes Ruth recognized from her own reflection 3 years ago. "Your Grace," the girl whispered. I was told to stay in corners after my scandal, but I heard you were once told the same. How did you escape?" Ruth saw herself in this girl and felt her heart break and mend simultaneously. "I stopped believing I belonged there, and I found someone who saw me even when I was invisible." "Did it hurt, coming back to life?" "Terribly," Ruth said honestly, "but it was worth it." The girl's eyes filled with tears and hope in equal measure. George offered Ruth his hand. "May I have this dance?" "Your Grace? Is that a command or a request?" "Neither." George's smile was genuine, warm. "It's a plea. Dance with me because you want to, not because anyone ordered it." "Then yes, always yes." They took the floor, and the crowd parted for them. As they waltzed, Ruth thought about the journey from that first commanded dance to this chosen one, from black mourning to crimson celebration, from corners to center stage, from broken to whole. "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Ruth asked. "You asked what I was mourning." "I do. You said you were mourning the woman you might have been." "I was wrong." Ruth looked up at him, her heart full. "I wasn't mourning her. I was becoming her. The woman I am now, strong, loved, free. She was always inside me, waiting. And the cold Duke of War? He's still there too," Ruth said tenderly. "But he's learned to feel warmth again. Because of you. Because of us. We saved each other, George." The music swelled. The ballroom spun around them in a kaleidoscope of colour and light. In a corner, a young woman in grey watched the Duke and Duchess, and for the first time in months, she felt hope. Miranda's letters with crimson seals were long burned to ash. Edmund lived in exile in Australia, carrying his shame. Catherine's memorial stood in its peaceful garden, honoured but no longer worshipped. And George and Ruth danced on, two people who had been told their stories had ended, who discovered instead that endings can be beginnings. Ruth caught George's eye and smiled. George smiled back, no longer cold, no longer frozen. The Duke of War had found peace, and the woman in black had found her colours again. She had been told to wear black and sit in corners forever. He had been told to mourn and remain frozen in grief. But they had defied every expectation, survived every scheme, and emerged not just alive but thriving. The ballroom that had once been Ruth's prison was now her palace. The isolation that had once defined George was now intimacy. They had commanded each other to dance that first night, he with words, she with silent courage. But every dance since had been a choice, freely made, joyfully taken. In a world that demanded they remain broken, they had chosen instead to heal, together, always together. If Ruth's journey from corners to crowns touched your heart, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories where the broken become whole. Comment your favorite moment below. Was it the first dance, the proposal, or the wedding drama? Let me know below. And don't forget to check the playlist for more sweeping romances. Remember, you're not defined by the corners they put you in. Your story isn't over. See you next time.